Okay, picture this. What if Ace didn't die at Marineford? What if Marco's Phoenix Flame saved him at the last second, and Luffy's sheer relief and rage awakened Gear 3 years early? Because holy shit, that changes everything. We're not talking about regular Luffy getting a power boost. We're talking about the Nika fruit awakening when Luffy's emotions are at absolute breaking point. This is reality warping, chain breaking, I refuse to accept your physics level broken. And then Whitebeard, with his dying breath, declares war alongside the Straw Hats. So basically, we get the most epic alliance in One Piece history taking on the world government's darkest secrets, ancient weapons, and 8 centuries of lies. Luffy doesn't just become stronger, he becomes the living embodiment of freedom itself, facing off against literal gods while his crew evolves alongside him. Trust me, this gets wild. Let's jump in. The magma fist came down like judgment itself. Luffy's scream tore through the air as Akainu's attack closed the final inches toward Ace. Time crawled. Everything slowed to a nightmare crawl, the heat shimmer rising from molten rock, the sick satisfaction on the Admiral's face, Ace's resigned acceptance of his fate. Not again, not like this. But then a wall of blue flame erupted between them. Phoenix Brand! Marco slammed into Akainu's side with everything he had, talons wreathed in regenerative fire. The impact sent the Admiral staggering, his magma fist missing Ace by inches. Instead of boring through his chest, the molten rock carved a savage gash across Ace's shoulder and ribs. Ace collapsed, smoke rising from his burns, but he was breathing. You bastard bird, Akainu roared, whirling on Marco. You think you can? Ace, Luffy's voice cracked like thunder. Something in that single word made everyone on the battlefield stop. The rage in it was inhuman, the pain was bottomless, and something else was building underneath it all. Akainu turned back to finish what he'd started, raising his other fist. One bird won't stop justice. Both of these criminals die today. That's when Luffy exploded. Not literally, though the shockwave that burst from him might as well have been an actual explosion. The air itself seemed to bend and ripple around him. His body stretched and contorted in ways that defied everything anyone knew about devil fruits. His hair turned white. His eyes rolled back, showing nothing but the whites. And when he opened his mouth to scream again, it wasn't quite human anymore. The sound hit Marineford like a physical force. Marines stumbled, pirates froze mid-stride, even the admirals took an involuntary step back. What the hell? Akainu started. Luffy's fist, now glowing with an otherworldly light, caught him square in the jaw. The admiral of the fleet went flying. Actually flying like a cannonball shot from the world's biggest gun. He smashed through 3 buildings before finally coming to rest in a crater that definitely hadn't been there 5 seconds ago. The battlefield went dead silent. Luffy landed in a crouch, his body still shifting between normal and something else entirely. His rubbery limbs had taken on a strange quality. They moved like liquid sometimes, solid as steel others. Steam rose from his skin. Luffy! Jinbei appeared at his side, catching him as he swayed. What was that? Your power, don't know, Luffy gasped, his hair flickering between black and white. Don't care, just Ace. He stumbled toward where Marco was crouched over Ace's smoking form. The 1st Division commander looked up, his usual laid-back expression replaced by grim concern. He's alive, but barely. These burns. Marco's healing flames danced over Ace's wounds, but they were struggling against the lingering magma heat. We need to move, now. Straw Hat, Sengoku's voice boomed across the plaza. The fleet admiral stood atop the execution platform, his expression a mixture of shock and terrible understanding. What have you done? What are you? Luffy looked up at him, and for a moment his eyes cleared. They held something that made hardened Marines take a step back, not just rage or determination, but a weight that seemed older than his 17 years. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, he said quietly, but somehow everyone heard him anyway. And I'm gonna be the Pirate King. The words hit different this time. They carried a resonance that seemed to echo in everyone's bones. Pops, Marco called out. We've got to go. Whitebeard stood in the center of the battlefield like a mountain that refused to fall. Blood covered his chest, his breathing was labored, but his eyes were sharp as he took in what had just happened to Luffy. So that's what you are, kid, the old man murmured. Then louder, all hands, we're leaving. You're not going anywhere. Kizaru appeared in a burst of light, aiming directly for Luffy's head. Can't have you running around with power like that. The kick never landed. Luffy moved faster than light somehow, catching Kizaru's leg and spinning the admiral like a ragdoll before hurling him into the harbor. How is he doing that? Someone shouted. That's impossible. Impossible or not, it was happening. Luffy's body had become something beyond normal rubber. He stretched and bounced and moved in ways that seemed to bend reality around him. When a squad of Marines tried to surround him, he simply stepped out of their circle, like space itself had shifted to accommodate him. "This is bad," Aokiji muttered, ice crystals forming around his feet. "If he can do this now, he can't control it," Marco observed, still supporting Ace. "Look at him." He was right. Luffy's power was incredible, but it was also clearly overwhelming him. His movements were erratic, sometimes stopping mid-motion as if he'd forgotten what he was doing. Sweat poured down his face and his breathing was ragged. "Luffy," Ace whispered, trying to sit up despite his injuries. "You idiot." "What did you do?" "Saved you," Luffy grinned, though it was strained. "That's what brothers do, right?" For a moment, Ace's face crumpled. Then he forced himself to his feet, flame dancing around his good hand. "Yeah, that's what brothers do." The retreat began in earnest then. Whitebeard's crew moved like the seasoned warriors they were, covering each other as they fell back toward their ship. But the Marines weren't about to let them go easily. "Don't let them escape," Sengoku roared. "Especially not Straw Hat. That power is exactly what we've been afraid of," a cold voice interrupted. Everyone turned. A figure in white robes stood at the edge of the battlefield, CP0, one of the world government's most elite agents. "Cypher Paul," Sengoku frowned. "What are you doing here?" "Our job," the agent replied calmly, "observing, recording, and confirming our worst fears." His masked face turned toward Luffy. "He's awakened it, hasn't he? The fruit we've been hunting for 800 years. A chill ran through the assembled Marines. Even they weren't cleared for information that old, that classified. "The Hito no Mi model Nika," the agent continued. "The liberation fruit, the most ridiculous power in the world." Luffy stumbled again, his strange form flickering. "Liberation? We cannot allow this." Another CP0 agent materialized nearby. "Code Black authorization. Eliminate the threat." They moved faster than most people could track, but Luffy wasn't most people anymore. He bent backward at an impossible angle, letting one agent sail overhead, then grabbed the other by the ankle and slammed him into the ground hard enough to crack stone. "Nobody decides what I am but me," he snarled, and that otherworldly resonance was back in his voice. The remaining CP0 agents hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Earthquake, Whitebeard brought his Bicento down, and Marineford shook like a leaf. Cracks split the ground between the pirates and their pursuers, buying precious seconds. "Move," Marco shouted, half carrying Ace toward the Moby Dick. "Everyone move!" The retreat became a running battle. Marines and world government agents pressed forward, trying to prevent the escape. Pirates fought desperate rearguard actions, protecting their wounded. And in the center of it all, Luffy raged like a force of nature. His power was unstable, unpredictable, but it was also absolute. When he punched, reality seemed to bend around his fist. When he moved, space itself accommodated him, but it was taking its toll. His breathing grew more labored with each use of his strange abilities. His movements became more erratic. "Kid's gonna burn himself out," Whitebeard observed, even as he held off 3 vice admirals at once. "That power, it's too much for him right now." "Then we better move faster," Marco grunted, finally reaching the ship with Ace. The Moby Dick's crew worked frantically to get underway. Engines roared to life, sails unfurled, but they were still too close to shore, too vulnerable. "They're getting away," Akainu had recovered from Luffy's surprise attack, though his jaw looked distinctly swollen. "All ships open fire." Cannon fire erupted from dozens of marine vessels. The first volley screamed toward the Whitebeard pirate's ship. Luffy appeared in the air above them, his body stretched impossibly wide. The cannonballs struck him and just bounced off, not like rubber, like they'd hit something that refused to accept their reality. Gomu no," Luffy's voice carried across the water. "Dawn rocket," he snapped back like a slingshot, but instead of launching himself, he launched the cannonballs. They flew back at twice their original speed, smashing into marine ships with devastating effect. "Impossible," Sengoku breathed. "He's turning their attacks into playthings." The CP0 agent beside him was frantically speaking into a Den Mushi. "Yes, confirmed. The Nika fruit has awakened. Early stage, but..." "Yes, sir, understood." He hung up and turned to Sengoku. "New orders from the 5 elders, let them go." "What?" Sengoku spun on him. "Are you insane? We have them right here." "And look what happened when we pushed too hard," the agent replied calmly. "The boy awakened 800 years of suppressed power. If we force him into a corner again..." He paused meaningfully. "The elders prefer to handle this more strategically." On the Moby Dick, Luffy finally collapsed. His hair flickered back to black and stayed there, his body returning to its normal proportions. He was unconscious before he hit the deck. Is he? Ace asked weakly. Alive, Marco confirmed, checking his pulse. But whatever he did, it took everything he had. And more, Whitebeard added gravely, looking down at the unconscious teenager. That wasn't just his devil fruit awakening. That was something else entirely. The ship finally pulled clear of Marineford's range. Behind them, the fortress burned in dozens of places, evidence of the most chaotic battle in marine history. Pops, Marco said quietly. What do we do now? The government's gonna come after us with everything they've got. Whitebeard was silent for a long moment, watching the smoke rise from the battlefield they were leaving behind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of inevitability. Then we give them a war they'll never forget. The old emperor looked down at Luffy's unconscious form, then at Ace's bandaged injuries, both boys who should have died today. Both now marked for death by the world government. They want to play God with people's lives, Whitebeard continued, his voice growing harder. Time they learned what happens when you threaten family. As the Moby Dick sailed into the setting sun, none of them noticed the small mechanical bird following at a distance, transmitting everything back to Mary Geoise. In the Holy Land, 5 old men sat around a table watching footage of Luffy's transformation with expressions of cold calculation. So it begins, one of them murmured. 800 years of preparation, another added. And now this boy threatens to undo it all. Not if we stop him first, the third declared. Alert all agents, Priority Alpha, the Nika fruit and anyone connected to it must be eliminated. Even Whitebeard, especially Whitebeard. If he forms an alliance with the boy, the speaker trailed off, but they all understood. What about Im-sama? Inform them, but suggest we handle this ourselves first. No need to disturb their rest unless absolutely necessary. The meeting adjourned, but the implications lingered. For the first time in 8 centuries, the world government faced a threat they had hoped never to see again. The boy who would laugh at their carefully ordered world. The boy who would set everything free. 3 days out from Marineford, and the Moby Dick felt like a floating funeral parlor. Whitebeard hadn't left his chair since they'd escaped. He sat there like a mountain that was slowly crumbling, each breath a visible effort. The wounds from his battle with Akainu had finally caught up with him. The holes in his chest whistled when he breathed, and blood stained everything he touched. But his eyes were still sharp as razors. How's the kid? He asked Marco, who was checking on Luffy for the dozenth time that morning. Still out cold. Marco's hands glowed with healing flames as he worked. Whatever he did back there, it burned through more energy than his body had. Hell, more than most people's bodies could even hold. Luffy lay unconscious on a makeshift bed, his face peaceful but drawn. Occasionally, he'd mumble something in his sleep, usually Ace or meat, but he hadn't shown any signs of waking up. And Ace, Marco glanced across the medical bay to where Ace sat slumped against the wall, staring at his bandaged hands. The burns from Akainu's attack were healing thanks to Marco's flames, but something else was eating at him. Physically, he'll live. Mentally, Marco shook his head. Take a guess. Ace hadn't spoken more than a few words since they'd escaped. He just sat there watching Luffy sleep, carrying guilt that was heavier than his chains had ever been. This is my fault, Ace finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. All of it. If I hadn't been so stupid, so reckless. If you hadn't been yourself, you mean? Whitebeard's voice carried across the room. Son, you can't blame yourself for having the heart of a pirate. Can't I? Ace looked up and his eyes were hollow. Look at him, Pops. Look what happened to Luffy because of me. He's 17 years old and he just... What did he become back there? That was the question that had been haunting everyone. What exactly had they witnessed at Marineford? Luffy's power had been beyond anything they'd ever seen, not just strong, but fundamentally different, like he'd stopped playing by the same rules as everyone else. I've been thinking about that, Whitebeard said slowly. In all my years on these seas, I've only heard whispers of power like that, old stories, legends that the world government tried very hard to bury. Marco straightened up. What kind of legends? The kind that make the 5 elders wake up in cold sweats. Whitebeard's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so grim. Joy Boy, the ancient kingdom. A fruit that could set the whole world free. You think Luffy's fruit is? I think that boy just painted a target on all our backs that's bigger than any bounty poster ever printed. Whitebeard coughed, specks of blood hitting his hand. And I think we're about to find out just how far the government will go to keep their secrets buried. A den mushi started ringing across the ship. Not the regular communication line, the emergency frequency that every major crew monitored. Marco answered it with a frown. Yeah, this is Fleet Admiral Sengoku. The voice was tired, strained. "I need to speak with Whitebeard." Everyone in the medical bay went silent. Marco looked to Whitebeard, who nodded. "He's here," Marco said carefully. "Edward Newgate." Sengoku's voice carried decades of conflict between them. "I'm calling under the old codes. Parley, I need to tell you something." "Speak your piece, Sengoku." There was a long pause. When Sengoku spoke again, his voice was different. Older, more human. "They're coming for all of you, not just Marines, something bigger. I just got done with a meeting I wasn't supposed to hear, but these old ears still work fine." Another pause. "Whatever your boy did at Marineford, it scared them. Really scared them. I've never seen the 5 elders move so fast." Whitebeard's expression didn't change. "And you're telling me this why? Because I'm a Marine, not a monster. And because what they're planning," Sengoku's voice trailed off, "let's just say it makes Marineford look like a schoolyard scuffle. How long do we have? Days, maybe a week if you're lucky. They're pulling strings I didn't even know existed. CP0, agents from divisions that don't officially exist, maybe even one of those science freaks from Vegapunk's labs." The connection started to crackle with static. "Edward," Sengoku said urgently, "whatever that kid awakened, they've been afraid of it for 800 years. Don't let them." The line went dead. The medical bay stayed silent for a long moment. Finally, Whitebeard spoke. "Marco, call all the division commanders. Emergency meeting. Pops, you should rest. I'll have plenty of time to rest soon enough." Whitebeard struggled to his feet, his massive frame swaying slightly. "Right now, I've got a war to plan." An hour later, the deck of the Moby Dick was crowded with some of the most dangerous pirates in the world. Division commanders, allied captains, veteran fighters who'd sailed with Whitebeard for decades. They all wore the same expression, grim determination mixed with barely contained fury. "Listen up," Whitebeard said, his voice carrying despite his obvious weakness. "What happened at Marineford was just the beginning. The government's coming after us with everything they've got." "Let them come," Vista snarled, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "We've faced them before. Not like this." Whitebeard shook his head. "This isn't about bounties or territory anymore. This is about something they're willing to break every rule to protect." He looked around at his assembled family, because that's what they were in every way that mattered. Straw Hat Luffy risked everything to save Ace. He awakened power that the government has spent centuries trying to suppress, and now they want to kill him for it. Whitebeard's voice grew harder. "They want to kill all of us to keep their secrets safe." "So what do we do?" Jazu asked. Whitebeard was quiet for a moment, looking out at the endless sea. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "We give them the war they're so afraid of." The reaction was immediate. Shouts of agreement, fists raised in defiance, the sound of weapons being drawn. These were pirates who'd never backed down from a fight, and they weren't about to start now. "But Pops," Marco said quietly, "this isn't just about us anymore. If we do this, we're dragging the Straw Hats into it too, and that kid already made his choice when he awakened that power to save Ace." Whitebeard looked toward the medical bay where Luffy still slept. "Now we make ours." He turned back to his crew, and for a moment he wasn't a dying old man anymore. He was Edward Newgate, the strongest man in the world, the one person the world government had never been able to break. "I hereby declare a formal alliance between the Whitebeard Pirates and the Straw Hat Pirates," he announced. "Anyone who wants to leave now, because what's coming next isn't going to be like anything we've faced before." Nobody moved. Not a single person. "Oi, Pops!" Everyone turned. Ace was standing in the doorway of the medical bay, still bandaged but on his feet. His eyes held something they hadn't seen since before his capture: fire. "You're talking about my little brother," Ace said. "You really think any of us would abandon him now?" Whitebeard smiled, really smiled, for the first time since Marineford. "No, son. I didn't think you would." Behind Ace, there was a commotion in the medical bay. Luffy was stirring, his eyes fluttering open. "Ace," Luffy's voice was weak, confused. "Are you?" "Did we?" "Yeah, little brother." Ace knelt beside the bed, his voice thick with emotion. "We made it, we're safe." "Good." Luffy tried to sit up, failed, and settled for a weak grin instead. "I was having the weirdest dream. I dreamed I could do all this crazy stuff with my powers, like really crazy stuff." "It wasn't a dream," Marco said gently. Luffy blinked, processing this. Then his expression grew serious, more serious than anyone had ever seen him look. "They're gonna come after us, aren't they? The government, because of what I did." It wasn't really a question. "Yeah," Whitebeard said simply, "they are. Then I guess we better be ready for them." Luffy struggled to sit up again, and this time he managed it. "Because I'm not letting anyone hurt my crew or my family." He looked around at the assembled pirates, these legendary fighters who just declared their lives forfeit for him and his crew. "Thank you," he said quietly. "All of you, don't thank us yet, kid." Whitebeard's expression was grave. "What's coming next is going to test all of us. The government's been playing a long game for 800 years and you just forced their hand. So we play a longer one," Luffy said simply. "However long it takes." There was something different about him now, not just the exhaustion from his power, but something deeper. A weight that hadn't been there before. The boy who'd charged headfirst into Marineford was still there, but he'd gained something in that battle, an understanding of just how high the stakes really were. "The others," Luffy said suddenly, "my crew, are they?" "Safe," Marco assured him. "Scattered to the winds like you planned, but safe, though they're probably going crazy wondering what happened to you. We need to contact them." "Bring them back," Luffy's voice was getting stronger. "If we're doing this, we're doing it together." "Luffy," Ace said carefully, "you don't understand what you're asking them to do. This isn't just going to be a fight. This is going to be a war against the world government itself. Some of them might not. They'll come," Luffy interrupted with absolute certainty. "They're my crew, they'll come." And somehow, looking at his younger brother's unwavering faith in his friends, Ace knew he was right. Meanwhile, at Marine headquarters, what was left of it, Fleet Admiral Sengoku sat in his office and tried to process what he'd just learned. The meeting with the Five Elders representative had been illuminating and terrifying. Project Cleanse, 800 years of preparation. The true history that had been hidden from even the highest-ranking Marines. And at the center of it all, a 17-year-old boy with rubber powers who might just be the key to bringing down everything the world government had built. "Sir?" Garp's voice came from the doorway. The old Marine looked haggard, older than Sengoku had ever seen him. "Garp." Sengoku didn't look up from his paperwork. "Come to gloat about your grandson? Come to ask what we're gonna do about him." Garp stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "That wasn't normal, Sengoku, what Luffy did at Marineford. That was something else entirely." "I know." Sengoku finally looked up and Garp was startled by how tired his old friend looked. "The question is, what are we willing to do to stop it?" "What do you mean?" Sengoku slid a file across his desk. Garp opened it, read the first page, and went very still. "They can't be serious," Garp said quietly. "Dead serious. The Five Elders have authorized the use of any and all resources to eliminate the Nika threat. That includes," Sengoku paused meaningfully. "Well, you read the file." Garp closed the folder with shaking hands. "I can't be part of this." "I know." Sengoku stood up, walking to the window that looked out over Marineford's destruction. "That's why I called you here, to give you a choice." "What kind of choice?" "The same one I'm making." Sengoku turned around and his expression was resolved. "Sometimes, to preserve justice, you have to be willing to stand against the people who claim to represent it." Back on the Moby Dick, Whitebeard sat alone on deck as night fell. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a struggle. He didn't have long left, days, maybe hours, but that was okay. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. Ace was alive. The boy who might change the world was awake and determined. And his family would carry on the fight even after he was gone. "Pops," Marco appeared beside him, medical supplies in hand. "You should let me." "No," Whitebeard waved him off. "Save your strength. You're gonna need it for what's coming." "Pops, I mean it, Marco." Whitebeard's voice was gentle but firm. "My time's ending, but yours is just beginning. Take care of them, all of them." "Ace, the Straw Hat Kid, our whole family." Marco nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "And Marco," Whitebeard looked out at the stars reflecting on the dark water, "make sure they know the truth. About Joy Boy, about the ancient kingdom, about why the government's so scared of that boy's power." "What is the truth, Pops?" Whitebeard smiled, and for a moment he looked like the young man who'd first set sail all those decades ago. "The truth, son, is that some powers are too big to be contained forever, and that boy just proved it." The night wind carried his words across the water, toward a future that none of them could fully imagine, a future where the sins of 8 centuries would finally come due, and the laughter of a rubber-powered teenager would echo across the world. Whitebeard died at sunset on the 4th day, sitting in his chair with his eyes on the horizon. There was no dramatic final battle, no last words of wisdom. One moment he was breathing, the next he wasn't. Marco felt it happen, the sudden absence where that overwhelming presence had been for so many years. "Pops," Marco's voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. But the old man was gone, his massive frame finally at rest after a lifetime of carrying the weight of the world. The silence that followed was absolute. 43 ships full of hardened pirates, and not one of them made a sound. Even the ocean seemed to hold its breath. Then Ace started crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears of a morning sun, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose world had just collapsed. He fell to his knees beside Whitebeard's chair, his whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry, Pops. This is all my fault. Everything that happened, everyone who got hurt." "Stop." Marco knelt beside him, his own eyes wet. "Just stop." "But if you hadn't been captured, Luffy never would have awakened that power," Marco said firmly. "And we never would have learned what the government's really capable of. Sometimes the worst things lead to the most important discoveries." Luffy, who'd been standing quietly nearby, finally spoke up. He died protecting his family. That's what he would have wanted. The simple truth of it cut through everyone's grief. Whitebeard had lived for his crew, his sons, his chosen family. And in the end, he died the same way, making sure they would survive what was coming. "What do we do now?" Vista asked quietly. All eyes turned to Marco and Ace, the two who'd been closest to the old man who'd learned the most from him. "We honor him," Marco said, standing up, "and we finish what he started." 3 days later, they held the funeral on a small island that Whitebeard had always loved. It was uninhabited, peaceful, with white beaches and clear water that reflected the sky like a mirror. Pirates came from across the New World, crews that had been allied with Whitebeard, others that had simply respected him. Even some of his old enemies showed up to pay their respects, but it was Shanks who delivered the eulogy. "Edward Newgate was a lot of things," the red-haired Yonko said, standing before the simple grave marker they'd erected. "He was the strongest man alive. He was the terror of the seas. He was the one man the world government never figured out how to break." Shanks paused, looking out at the assembled crowd, hundreds of pirates who'd put aside their differences for this moment. But more than any of that, he was a father. To every lost soul who needed a family, every kid who'd been thrown away by the world. He proved that blood doesn't make family, choice does. Luffy listened from the front row, still weak from his awakening but determined to be here. Beside him, Ace sat with his head bowed, trying to process the reality of a world without Whitebeard in it. "And now he's passed that choice on to us," Shanks continued. "The choice to be family, to protect each other, to stand against anyone who tries to hurt the people we love." After the service, as the various crews began to disperse, Shanks approached Luffy. "So," the Yonko said, settling down on the beach beside his former cabin boy. "I hear you've been busy." Luffy managed a weak smile. "You could say that. Marco told me what happened at Marineford, what you became." Shanks's expression was serious now. "Do you understand what that means?" "Not really," Luffy admitted. "I mean, I know it's important. I know the government's scared of it, but I don't really get why." Shanks was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the waves. 800 years ago," he finally said, "there was a man called Joy Boy. He had the same power you do, and he nearly brought down the world government. What happened to him? Same thing that's going to happen to you if you're not careful." Shanks turned to look at him directly. "They killed him, erased him from history, made sure no one would ever know his name or what he stood for." Luffy frowned. "But I'm not him." "No, you're not. You're something they didn't plan for, someone who awakened that power in the modern world with modern allies and modern technology." Shanks smiled grimly. "You scare them more than Joy Boy ever did." "Good," Luffy said simply. "They should be scared." "Luffy," Shanks's voice was serious. "What you're planning to do, this war with the world government, it's going to cost everything. People are going to die, people you care about." "People I care about are already dying," Luffy replied. "Ace almost died. How many others like him are out there? How many people are suffering because of what these guys have done?" Shanks studied his face, seeing the weight that hadn't been there before Marineford. The boy was still there, but he was growing into something else, something dangerous. "All right," Shanks said finally, "but if you're going to do this, you're going to need help, real help. I've got the Whitebeard pirates. You're going to need more than that." Shanks stood up, brushing sand off his coat. "Lucky for you, there are a lot of people in this world who have reasons to hate the world government." That evening, the real planning began. The Whitebeard pirates had gathered in the island's largest cave, along with representatives from several allied crews. Maps covered every surface, marked with marine bases, government facilities, and potential targets. "The way I see it," Marco said, addressing the assembled captains, "we've got two options. We can run and hide, hoping they eventually give up, or we can hit them so hard they don't get a chance to organize a proper response." "Running's not an option," Ace said firmly. He'd been quiet most of the day, but now he looked up from the maps with fire in his eyes. "They killed Pops. They tortured me. They tried to execute me in front of the whole world just to make a point. And they'll do it again to anyone who threatens them," added Izo. "To Luffy, to any of us." Luffy, who'd been unusually quiet during the planning session, finally spoke up. "My crew's coming back," he announced. "I sent word to all of them. They should be here within the week." "Luffy," Marco said carefully, "you need to understand what you're asking them to do. This isn't going to be like your other adventures. This is going to be a real war against people who won't hesitate to kill them." "I know," Luffy's voice was steady, certain. "And they'll come anyway, because that's what Nakama do." There was something in the way he said it that made everyone in the cave believe him. "So what's the plan?" Vista asked. Marco spread out a larger map, this one showing the entire Grand Line. "We hit them where it hurts most," he said. "Not their military bases, their infrastructure, the things they use to control the world." "Enies lobby," suggested Jazu. "Already destroyed it once," Luffy pointed out. "They'll probably rebuild it stronger." "Impel down," Ace said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "Think about it, it's not just a prison, it's a symbol. It says that anyone who opposes the government disappears forever." And, Marco added, catching on to Ace's line of thinking, "It's full of people who have very good reasons to hate the world government." "A jailbreak," Izo mused. "Mass liberation of political prisoners. It would be chaos." "Good chaos," Luffy said with a grin that reminded everyone why they'd followed him into this mess in the first place. "It's not going to be easy," Marco warned. "Magellan's still the chief warden, and after your last visit, they've probably upgraded security." "Then we'll just have to be better than their security," Ace replied. "Besides, we're not the same crew that broke in there before. We're stronger now." As they continued planning, none of them noticed the small drone hovering outside the cave entrance, its mechanical eyes recording everything. Meanwhile, in Mary Geo's, the 5 elders sat in emergency session. The room was tense, filled with an urgency that hadn't been present in centuries. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly," St. Jagartia Saturn announced, consulting a thick folder of reports. "Intelligence confirms that Whitebeard's death has only strengthened their resolve. They're actively recruiting allies." "How many ships?" asked St. Marcus Mars. 43 confirmed Whitebeard vessels, plus at least a dozen allied crews. And that's not counting whoever else might join them. St. Topman Warcury slammed his hand on the table. "This is what happens when we allow sentiment to override pragmatism. We should have eliminated the Nika fruit user the moment he awakened." "Hindsight serves no purpose now," St. Ethanbaron V. Nusjuro said calmly. "What matters is our response." "Project Cleanse is already in motion," Saturn replied. "All available CP agents have been activated. Vegapunk has been ordered to accelerate his research into anti-devil fruit weapons, and we've authorized the deployment of," he paused, "special assets." "The Seraphim?" Mars asked. "Among others," St. Shepherd Jupiter, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "What about the admirals? Can we count on their full cooperation?" Akainu is eager to make up for his failure at Marineford. "Kizaru will follow orders as always." Saturn hesitated. "Aokiji and Fujitora may prove problematic." "How problematic?" Both have expressed concerns about the scope of Project Cleanse. Aokiji in particular seems to sympathize with some of the pirates' grievances. "Then they'll be reassigned," Peter said coldly. "We cannot afford divided loyalties, not when facing a threat of this magnitude. And if they refuse reassignment, then they'll be dealt with accordingly." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. They were talking about potentially executing Marine admirals for insufficient loyalty. "Are we certain this is necessary?" Nusjuro asked quietly. "The boy is powerful, yes, but he's still just one person." "One person with the most dangerous ability in the world," Saturn replied. "The power to make people laugh in the face of authority, to make them believe they can be free." "That's not a devil fruit power," Mars observed. "That's just charisma." "No," Saturn shook his head. "It's more than that. The Nika fruit doesn't just grant physical abilities, it grants the power to inspire hope. And hope, gentlemen, is the most dangerous weapon our enemies can wield." Peter leaned forward. "How long until our forces are in position?" 72 hours for the initial strike, full deployment within a week. Then we proceed. Authorization code void century. All assets, all resources, all necessary force. As the meeting broke up, none of them spoke about the other implication of what they were planning. Project Cleanse wasn't just about eliminating the Nika fruit user and his allies. It was about eliminating anyone who might carry their story forward. Back on the island, Luffy sat alone on the beach as night fell. His crew would be arriving soon. He could feel it somehow, like they were all connected by invisible threads that distance couldn't break. Nami would come with her maps and her weather knowledge. Zoro would come with his swords and his unwavering loyalty. Sanji would come with his kicks and his protective instincts. Robin would come with her dangerous knowledge and her gentle wisdom. They'd all come because that's what family did. Can't sleep either. Ace settled down beside him, wincing slightly from his healing injuries. Just thinking, Luffy replied. About what's coming, about what we're fighting for. Luffy picked up a handful of sand, letting it run through his fingers. Shanks thinks this is all about some old war, some guy named Joy Boy who lived forever ago. Maybe it is. Maybe, Luffy shrugged. But I don't really care about any of that. I just care about keeping the people I love safe. Ace was quiet for a moment. You know there's a good chance we don't all make it through this, right? Yeah, Luffy's voice was steady. But there's also a chance we change the world. And if we don't try, then people like you keep getting hurt just for existing. Is that really worth risking everything for? Luffy turned to look at his brother, and Ace was struck by how much older his eyes looked than they had just a week ago. Ace, Luffy said quietly, if we don't fight for the right to exist freely, then what's the point of being free at all? In the distance, a ship's light appeared on the horizon. Then another, and another. Luffy grinned, and for a moment he was just a 17-year-old kid again, excited to see his friends. They came, he said softly. Of course they came, Ace replied, smiling despite everything. They're your crew. As the Thousand Sunny drew closer to shore, followed by several other vessels carrying the scattered Straw Hat pirates, Luffy stood up and waved. Even from this distance, he could hear Chopper's excited voice carrying across the water. The war was coming. The world government was mobilizing forces that hadn't been used in centuries. People were going to die, and the world was going to change in ways that no one could predict. But right now, in this moment, all that mattered was that his family was coming home. And tomorrow, they'd start planning how to tear down 800 years of lies. The Straw Hat reunion was exactly what anyone who knew them would expect, loud, chaotic, and involving an enormous amount of food. Sanji had somehow managed to prepare a feast for 300 people using only the supplies on the Sunny, while Chopper bounced between crew members checking for injuries with the manic energy of a doctor who'd been worried sick for weeks. Nami alternated between hugging Luffy and hitting him for making them all worry, and Brook played celebration music that could probably be heard from the next island over. But it was Robin who surprised everyone. Luffy, she said quietly, pulling him aside after the initial chaos had died down. We need to talk. Her tone made everyone go still. Robin didn't use that voice unless something was seriously wrong. What's up? Luffy asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected this wasn't going to be simple. Instead of answering directly, Robin pulled out a Den Mushi, not their regular communication snail, but a different one entirely. Black shell's serious expression, military bearing. Where did you get that? Frankie asked, his voice unusually subdued. It found me, Robin replied, 3 days ago on Sabaody, along with this. She handed Luffy a letter. The paper was expensive, the handwriting elegant, but it was the symbol in the corner that made several people step back. A distinctive flag with a dragon wrapped around the world. The Revolutionary Army, Zoro observed, his hand instinctively moving toward his swords. They want to meet, Robin continued. Tonight, if possible. Apparently what happened at Marineford has implications beyond what any of us realized. Marco, who'd been standing nearby, suddenly looked very alert. Did they say what kind of implications? The kind that involve 800-year-old conspiracies and devil fruits that the world government has spent centuries trying to destroy. Robin's voice was calm, but her eyes were troubled. They know about your awakening, Luffy, and they think they know why it happened now. The beach fell silent except for the sound of waves against the shore. Well, Luffy said finally, I guess we're having a meeting. The Revolutionary Army's representative wasn't who anyone expected. Sabo arrived alone, in a small boat that looked like it had been through several battles. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to fight from multiple masters, but there was something different about him, a weight that hadn't been there during his brief encounter with Luffy at Dressrosa. Little brother, he said, embracing Luffy tightly. Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Sabo, Luffy's face lit up, though the expression quickly turned serious. Are you here about the Revolutionary Army thing, or both? Sabo glanced around at the assembled pirates, Straw Hats, Whitebeard survivors, allied captains. What I'm about to tell you affects everyone here. Hell, it affects everyone alive. He settled down on a piece of driftwood, suddenly looking older than his years. The Revolutionary Army has been fighting the world government for decades, he began. But we've always been fighting the symptoms, not the disease. Corrupt nobles, abusive marines, unfair laws. We thought if we could just change the system. But it's bigger than that, Robin finished quietly. Isn't it? Much bigger, Sabo nodded toward her. Dragon sent me because of you actually, your knowledge of the poneglyphs combined with what Luffy awakened. He paused. We think we finally understand what we're really fighting. Marco leaned forward. Enlighten us. The world government isn't just a political organization, Sabo said. It's a religious cult. They worship something called the Void Century, not the time period, but what happened during it, what they did during it. Which was, Ace asked. Genocide. The word hung in the air like a curse. Not just of people, but of ideas. Of freedom itself. The ancient kingdom that Joy Boy represented wasn't just destroyed, it was erased from history so thoroughly that most people don't even know it existed. Luffy's expression was growing darker with each word. And my fruit, he asked quietly. Your fruit was Joy Boy's fruit, the symbol of everything they destroyed. They've been hunting it for 8 centuries, making sure it never awakened again. Sabo looked directly at his adopted brother. Until now, so what does that make me? The thing they've been having nightmares about for 800 years, Sabo replied grimly. The return of everything they tried to kill. Before anyone could respond, the Den Den Mushi in Robin's pocket started ringing. Not the Revolutionary Army snail, a different one entirely. That's impossible, Nami said, frowning. How does anyone even have this number? Robin answered it cautiously. Yes, Miss All Sunday. The voice was gravelly, familiar, and completely unexpected. Or should I say, Nico Robin, this is Vice Admiral Smoker. The entire beach went dead silent. Admiral Smoker, Robin replied carefully. This is unexpected. I'll bet. Listen, I don't have long before someone notices I'm making unauthorized calls, so I'll make this quick. You and your crew are in more danger than you realize. We're aware of the threat from the world government, not from the world government. From something bigger, Smoker's voice was tense. There are things happening in Marine headquarters that don't make sense, orders coming from people who supposedly don't exist. Weapons being deployed that we've never heard of. Why are you telling us this? Luffy asked, loud enough for the snail to pick up. Because whatever's coming, it's not about justice, it's about control. And I didn't become a Marine to help control people. Smoker paused. There are others like me, Marines who joined to protect people, not to serve politicians. How many others? Marco asked. More than you'd think. Less than we need. Another pause. Look, I can't promise anything official, but if you need information or if there's a way to work together. You'd betray your own organization? Ace asked, disbelief clear in his voice. I'd betray the organization that betrayed everything it was supposed to stand for, Smoker corrected. The Marines I joined were supposed to protect people. These people. Whatever they're planning, protection isn't part of it. The line went dead, leaving everyone staring at the Den Den Mushi in shock. Well, Frankie said finally, that was unexpected, but not unwelcome, Robin added thoughtfully. If we have allies within the Marine organization, we have intelligence, Sabo finished. And intelligence wins wars. Speaking of intelligence, Marco said, pulling out his own Den Den Mushi. I've got someone else you should probably meet. The call connected quickly. Dark King Rayleigh speaking, came the familiar voice of the former Roger Pirate. Rayleigh, Luffy's face lit up. Are you okay? I heard Sabo OD got pretty crazy after Marineford. I'm fine, boy. More importantly, how are you? That awakening. Rayleigh's voice carried a mixture of pride and concern. I felt it from here. Power like that comes with a price. Yeah, I figured that out. Luffy unconsciously flexed his hands, and for a moment everyone could see the strain still written in his movements. It's getting easier to control, but it still feels like it's not entirely mine yet. That's because it's not, Rayleigh said simply. The Nika fruit isn't like other devil fruits, Luffy. It doesn't just give you power, it gives you responsibility. The responsibility to use that power the way Joy Boy would have wanted. How am I supposed to know what some guy from 800 years ago would have wanted? Because you already know. Rayleigh's voice was gentle but firm. You've been using that power the same way since you first set sail, to protect the people you care about, to set people free. But it's not enough, Luffy said, frustration creeping into his voice. Even with this new power, the government's still out there. They're still hurting people. Then get stronger, Rayleigh replied simply. I can't be there to train you personally, too dangerous with all the attention you're drawing. But I can guide you through the Den Den Mushi, help you understand what you've awakened. Would you really do that? Luffy asked. Boy, I helped train the Pirate King. You think I'm going to pass up the chance to train the man who might surpass him? As conversations continued around the beach, plans beginning to form, none of them noticed the small figures moving through the shadows at the island's edge. CP0 agents had been tracking them for hours. Target confirmed, Agent Masked-1 whispered into his communication device. Both primary objectives are present. Straw Hat Luffy and Fire Fist Ace, along with most of the Whitebeard remnants. Collateral damage acceptable, came the reply. Extensive, Revolutionary Army representative also present, plus unknown Marine contacts. Proceed with extreme prejudice. Authorization level void. Masked-1 gestured to his team. 5 of the world government's most elite assassins, each one capable of taking down a normal pirate crew single-handedly. But these weren't normal pirates. Remember, Masked-1 said quietly, primary target is the Nika user, everything else is secondary. They moved like shadows, using techniques that had been perfected over centuries of covert operations. Silent, invisible, deadly, they made it within 50 yards of the beach before Zoro's swords cleared their sheaths. We've got company, the swordsman announced calmly. The party atmosphere evaporated instantly. Pirates who'd been laughing and drinking suddenly had weapons in their hands, eyes scanning the darkness. How many? Marco asked. 5 that I can sense, Zoro replied. Probably more. CP0, Robin said grimly. They move in teams of 5 for major operations. Sabo was already on his feet, his pipe materializing in his hand. Well, that didn't take long. The first attack came without warning, a Rankyaku so fast it was nearly invisible, aimed directly at Luffy's head. He tilted his head at the last second, the air blade carving a deep gouge in the sand where he'd been standing. Okay, Luffy said, his voice taking on that resonant quality that meant trouble. I guess we're doing this now. The battle that followed was unlike anything the island had ever seen. CP0 agents were used to fighting powerful opponents, but they weren't prepared for what Luffy had become. His awakened rubber powers let him bend and twist in ways that defied physics, turning their precisely calculated attacks into wild misses. When Masked-1 tried to use Shigan on him, Luffy's chest simply moved. Not just stretched, moved, like the attack was happening in a different reality entirely. Impossible, the agent hissed. GOMU no. Luffy's fist took on that strange otherworldly glow. Dawn Gatling, the barrage of punches that followed didn't just hit the agent, they hit the space around him, the very concept of dodging becoming irrelevant. Masked-1 went flying, crashing through several trees before disappearing into the darkness. Meanwhile, the rest of the battlefield had erupted into chaos. Zoro was engaged with 2 agents simultaneously, his 3-sword style creating a whirlwind of steel that kept them at bay. Marco had taken to the air, Phoenix flames providing light while he harassed enemies from above. But it was Ace who surprised everyone. His fire had always been powerful, but now there was something different about it. More focused, more intense. When he faced off against Masked-3, his flames burned blue-white instead of their usual orange. You're not the same person we have files on, the agent observed, dodging a particularly vicious fire spear. No, Ace agreed, pressing his attack. I'm someone who learned that running away doesn't solve anything. His next attack, Entei, was 3 times larger than anything he'd produced before Marineford. The miniature sun slammed into the agent with enough force to melt sand into glass. The battle was over in minutes, but the implications would last much longer. Well, Sabo said, looking at the unconscious CP0 agents scattered around the beach. I guess subtlety's off the table. Was it ever on the table? Nami asked dryly. Fair point. Sabo turned to Luffy, his expression serious. This changes things. If they're sending CP0 after you openly, it means they've moved past trying to handle this quietly. So what do we do? Chopper asked nervously. We get stronger, Luffy said simply, and we find more allies. Speaking of allies, Marco said, checking his Den Mushi, I'm getting reports from our intelligence network. Several marine bases have gone dark in the last few hours, not attacked, just silent. Purges, Robin said quietly. They're eliminating anyone who might sympathize with us. Which means, Sabo added grimly, we're running out of time to build our coalition. Luffy looked around at the assembled faces, his crew, the Whitebeard remnants, his brother, representatives of forces that had been fighting the world government for years. Then we move faster, he said. Rayleigh, you said you could help me train through the Den Mushi every day if needed. Good. Sabo, can the Revolutionary Army provide intelligence on government installations? Already working on it. Marco, how many allied crews can we count on? At least 20, maybe more if we can prove we're serious about this. And Smoker, Luffy continued, if he's willing to share information. He is, came the Marine's voice from Robin's Den Mushi. In fact, I've got something you need to know right now. The government's mobilizing something called Project Cleanse. I don't know all the details, but the scope is extensive. How extensive? Ace asked. They're not just coming after you, Smoker replied grimly. They're coming after everyone who's ever helped you, everyone who's ever opposed them, everyone who might carry your story forward. The beach went silent as the implications sank in. So it's not just a war, Nami said quietly. It's an extinction campaign. Then we better make sure we win, Luffy said simply. As the night wore on and plans began to form, none of them realized they were being watched by something far more dangerous than CP0 agents. High above, invisible to normal observation, a mechanical eye recorded everything. Dr. Vegapunk's greatest creation had been deployed ahead of schedule. The Seraphim were coming. The attack on Enies lobby began at dawn, which Luffy later admitted was probably a mistake. We should have gone at night, Nami muttered, crouched behind the rubble of what used to be the courthouse steps. All this dramatic sunrise stuff is great for morale, but terrible for stealth. Since when do we do stealth? Luffy asked, dodging a cannon blast that turned the wall behind him into powder. Besides, I wanted them to see us coming. Why? Because fear is a weapon too, Sabo answered, appearing beside them in a burst of displaced air. And right now, the government needs to be afraid. The new Enies lobby was everything the old one had been, but bigger. Stronger, more heavily fortified. After the Straw Hats' previous visit, the world government had rebuilt their judicial fortress with one clear message: never again. Too bad they hadn't counted on facing an army. 47 pirate ships had answered the call, along with a dozen revolutionary army vessels that officially weren't supposed to exist. The assault force was easily the largest pirate coalition in decades, and they'd hit Enies lobby like a tidal wave of chaos and fury. Marco, status report. Luffy called into his Den Mushi while casually deflecting machine gun fire with his bare hands. His awakened rubber body didn't just bounce bullets, it seemed to redirect their momentum wherever he wanted. East Gate is breached, Marco's voice crackled back. But they've got some new kind of defense system, laser grids that track devil fruit users specifically. Let me guess, Ace's voice joined the conversation from his position at the West Gate. Vegapunk technology. Has to be, these aren't normal marine weapons. Luffy frowned, his fist stretching out to punch a marine who was trying to flank their position. The man went flying, but Luffy was already thinking 3 moves ahead. Robin, any luck finding those documents Sabo mentioned? Working on it, came her voice, strained with concentration. But this place is a maze. They've compartmentalized everything since our last visit. The documents were the reason for this entire assault. Revolutionary Army intelligence had suggested that the new Enies lobby contained historical archives, records that the world government had thought destroyed centuries ago. Records about Joy Boy, the ancient kingdom, and the true nature of the Void Century. Records that might explain exactly what Luffy had become. Movement on the North Tower, Zoro's voice cut through the communication. Big movement. Someone important's heading for the archives. On it, Luffy said, but before he could move, something slammed into the ground between him and his destination. The figure that rose from the crater was tall, imposing, and wearing the coat of a marine admiral. Admiral Fujitora stood slowly, his sword still sheathed, blind eyes somehow fixed directly on Luffy. So, Fujitora said calmly, as chaos raged around them. You're the young man who's caused all this fuss. Admiral Fujitora, Luffy replied, settling into a fighting stance. Something about the man's posture suggested this wasn't going to be a typical battle. I've been wanting to meet you, Fujitora continued, drawing his sword in one smooth motion. The boy who awakened a power that's been sleeping for 8 centuries. Are we gonna fight or are we gonna talk? Both, I suspect. Fujitora raised his blade, and Luffy felt the familiar tingle of gravity manipulation. I'm curious about something. The reports say you awakened your devil fruit to save your brother, that your power comes from love, not hate. So I wonder. Fujitora's gravity field expanded, pressing down on everything around them. What happens when that love is tested? The attack came without warning, a localized gravity well that should have crushed Luffy into paste. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Luffy's body didn't resist the gravity. It embraced it, flowing around the crushing force like it was made of liquid light. His form stretched and bent in ways that seemed to ignore the laws of physics entirely. Interesting, Fujitora murmured. Your body isn't just rubber anymore, is it? I don't really understand it myself, Luffy admitted, launching himself forward in a trajectory that curved around Fujitora's gravity field. But it feels Right. Like this is what I was always supposed to be. Gomu no Dawn Whip, his arm stretched out, but instead of moving in a straight line, it followed an impossible spiral path that bypassed Fujitora defenses entirely. The admiral barely managed to block with his sword, the impact sending shockwaves through the courtyard. Your power, Fujitora said, breathing hard from the exchange. It's not just about stretching anymore, is it? You're bending reality itself, something like that. Luffy landed lightly, his body still rippling with that otherworldly energy. Why aren't you trying to capture me? Because I'm beginning to think you might be right. The words hung in the air between them as the battle raged around them. Marines and pirates clashed in desperate combat, but suddenly the two most powerful fighters on the battlefield were just talking. Right about what? About the world government. Fujitora's expression was grim. I've been a Marine for less than 2 years, but in that time I've seen things that make me question everything. Orders that have nothing to do with justice. Weapons designed to kill civilians. Purges of anyone who asks uncomfortable questions. So why are you still wearing that coat? Because I hoped I could change things from the inside. Fujitora's laugh was bitter, but after Project Cleanse was announced, I realized some systems can't be reformed, they can only be replaced. Before Luffy could respond, an explosion rocked the North Tower. Through the smoke and debris, a familiar figure emerged, running at full speed toward their position. Robin vaulted over the courtyard wall, a thick folder clutched against her chest and blood running from a cut on her forehead. Got them, she called out. But we need to leave now. What's in there? Sabo asked, appearing beside them with his pipe crackling with residual energy. Everything, Robin replied breathlessly. The real history, Joy Boy's identity, the reason they're so afraid of Luffy's power. Well, Luffy asked impatiently. What does it say? Robin looked around at the assembled faces, Luffy, Sabo, Fujitora, and the various pirates who'd gathered during the lull in combat. Joy Boy wasn't just someone with the Nika fruit, she said slowly. He was the leader of the ancient kingdom, and that kingdom, it wasn't destroyed in war. What do you mean? Ace's voice came through the Den Mushi. It chose to disappear, Robin continued, her voice growing stronger as she read from the documents. When they realized the world government was willing to commit genocide to maintain control, the entire kingdom used some kind of ancient technology to scatter to hide their people, their knowledge, their ideals throughout the world. Like seeds, Sabo breathed, waiting to grow when the time was right. Exactly, and Joy Boy, he made a promise. That someday someone would awaken the Nika fruit again, someone who would gather those scattered seeds and finish what he started. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Around them, the battle continued, but somehow it felt less immediate, less important than the words Robin had just spoken. So what does that make me? He finally asked. The fulfillment of an 800-year-old promise, Robin replied simply. The one who's supposed to bring the dawn. Dawn? Fujitora asked. What kind of dawn? The kind that ends the longest night in human history, Sabo said grimly. The kind that brings freedom back to a world that's forgotten what it means. A new sound cut through their conversation, the distinct whine of charging energy weapons. High above them, mechanical figures descended from the sky like falling angels. Seraphim, Fujitora breathed. They deployed the Seraphim. The mechanical beings were beautiful and terrible at the same time. They looked like children, but their eyes glowed with inhuman light and their wings crackled with destructive energy. Each one bore the face of a former warlord, twisted into something cold and merciless. Everyone fall back to the ships, Marco's voice boomed across the battlefield. We're outgunned, but Luffy didn't retreat. He stood his ground as the Seraphim landed around him, their laser weapons charging with deadly intent. You know what? He said quietly, his hair beginning to shift toward white. I'm getting really tired of people trying to kill my friends. The transformation was smoother this time, more controlled. His body took on that liquid-like quality, but his movements remained precise, purposeful. This wasn't the wild explosion of power from Marineford, this was focused fury. Gomu no. His voice carried that otherworldly resonance that made reality itself seem to bend. Dawn liberation, what happened next defied description. Luffy moved like he was dancing, his body flowing between the Seraphim attacks with impossible grace. But more than that, wherever he touched them, the mechanical beings seemed to. Remember something? The first Seraphim he reached stopped mid-attack, its glowing eyes flickering. For just a moment, Bartholomew Kuma's face looked almost human again. What's happening to them? Sabo asked in wonder. He's setting them free, Robin breathed. The Nika power, it doesn't just affect people, it affects anything that was once free and has been enslaved. One by one, the Seraphim stopped attacking. Their mechanical programming warred with something deeper, something that remembered what it meant to choose. Impossible, came a cold voice from the destroyed courthouse. The Seraphim are perfect weapons. They have no will to corrupt. The speaker emerged from the shadows, a CP0 agent in pristine white robes, but this one was different. Older, more dangerous. The kind of person who'd been killing for the world government since before most of the pirates on the battlefield had been born. Nothing is perfect, Luffy replied, his awakened form still rippling with energy, and everyone deserves the right to choose. Choose, the agent laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You think this is about choice, this is about order. About stability, about preventing chaos. Preventing freedom, you mean? Freedom is chaos, the agent snarled. Freedom is what destroyed the ancient kingdom. Freedom is what leads to war and suffering and death. No, Fujitora said suddenly, stepping forward. Preventing freedom is what leads to war and suffering and death. The Marine Admiral's sword was drawn, but it wasn't pointed at Luffy anymore. It was pointed at the CP0 agent. Admiral Fujitora, the agent said coldly, you're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was believing the world government wanted justice. Fujitora's gravity field expanded, pressing down on the agent. You want to know what I've learned in my 2 years as an admiral? Enlighten me. That the strongest chains aren't made of sea stone or steel, they're made of fear. Fear of change, fear of loss, fear of the unknown. Fujitora's power intensified. But this boy, he's teaching people not to be afraid anymore. The agent tried to dodge, but Fujitora's gravity held him in place. Luffy moved with that fluid grace, his fist connecting with devastating force. Gomu no Dawn Punch. The impact sent the agent flying, but more importantly, it shattered something. Not just his body, his certainty. For just a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. The evacuation's complete, Marco's voice called out. Time to go. As the combined fleet began its retreat, Luffy looked back at Enies' lobby. The fortress was burning again, but this time felt different. This time, they'd taken something the world government couldn't replace. The truth. So what now? Ace asked as they regrouped on the Moby Dick. We've got the documents, but we've also revealed our hand. They know we're organized now. Good, Luffy said simply. Let them know, let everyone know. He looked around at the assembled crew, pirates and revolutionaries, marines and outcasts, all united by a single idea. We're not hiding anymore, he continued. We're not running. We're going to tell everyone the truth about what the world government really is, and then we're going to give them a choice. What kind of choice? Chopper asked. The most important one. Luffy's eyes held that weight again, that understanding of the stakes involved. Whether they want to be free or whether they want to stay in chains. As the fleet sailed away from the burning fortress, Robin spread the stolen documents across a table. Page after page of suppressed history, hidden truths, forgotten promises. Luffy, she said quietly, there's something else in here, something about the final island, about what Roger found at Laugh Tale. What about it? Robin's expression was grave. It wasn't just treasure, it was a message, from Joy Boy to whoever would come after him. What did it say? When the drums of liberation beat again, the dawn will finally come. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the sky. But for the first time in 800 years, it sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. The drums were starting to beat. The call came at 3 in the morning, which should have been everyone's first warning that something was very wrong. Luffy was in the middle of his training session with Rayleigh, conducted through Den Mushi since the Dark King couldn't risk showing up in person, when every communication device on the ship started screaming at once. That's the emergency frequency, Marco said, grabbing the nearest snail. All channels. This is Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, Akainu's voice crackled through the speakers, cold and furious, to all Marine units worldwide. As of 300 hours, Operation Absolute Justice is now in effect. The training stopped. Everyone on deck went silent. All personnel are hereby ordered to capture or eliminate the following targets with extreme prejudice. Monkey D. Luffy, Portgas D. Ace, and any individual providing aid or comfort to the terrorist organization styling itself as the Liberation Alliance. Liberation Alliance, Nami whispered. Since when are we called that? Since the government decided we needed a scarier name, Sabo replied grimly from his own ship nearby. Furthermore, Akainu's voice continued, any Marine who fails to comply with these orders or who questions the authority of this command will be considered in violation of military law and subject to immediate court-martial. Translation, Smoker's voice cut in on a private channel. They're purging anyone who won't follow illegal orders. How bad is it? Robin asked. Bad. 3 vice admirals have been arrested in the last hour, dozens of captains have gone missing, and that's just at headquarters. The transmission continued. This organization represents an existential threat to world peace and stability. They possess weapons of mass destruction and have demonstrated willingness to use them against civilian targets. Weapons of mass destruction, Chopper squeaked. They mean me, Luffy said quietly, his expression darker than anyone had seen it. They're talking about my awakening. Therefore, all available assets are authorized for deployment, including experimental units and classified weapon systems. There will be no negotiation, no quarter given, and no mercy shown. The transmission ended, leaving them in dead silence. Then every horizon erupted with light. Battle stations, Marco roared as marine warships materialized from all directions, their spotlights turning night into day. We're surrounded, but that wasn't the worst of it. Rising from the ocean like mechanical leviathans, massive vessels that belonged to no fleet anyone recognized. Government ships, but not marine, something else entirely. CP-0 dreadnoughts, Robin breathed. I've seen them in classified documents, but I thought they were theoretical. Apparently not, Zoro said, his hands already on his swords. Count, 12 marine battleships, 8 CP-0 vessels, and Marco squinted into the distance. Something big coming from the east, really big. What emerged from the dawn mist was a floating fortress, not a ship, but an actual castle riding on the waves, bristling with weapons that definitely weren't standard marine issue. That's impossible, Frankie muttered. Nothing that big should be able to float. Vegapunk technology, Sabo's voice came through the Den Den Mushi, has to be, they're throwing everything at us. All ships prepare for combat, Luffy called out, but his voice carried that otherworldly resonance now. The sound seemed to echo across the water, reaching every vessel in their makeshift fleet. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. The battle began with a barrage that lit up the sky like a second sunrise. Cannon fire, laser beams, and weapons that defied description filled the air between the opposing fleets. But this wasn't like the chaotic free-for-all at Marineford. This was coordinated, precise, overwhelming. The world government had learned from their previous encounters. They're hurting us, Marco observed as Phoenix flames danced around his transformed body, trying to force us into a kill zone. Then we don't let them, Ace replied, his own flames burning brighter than ever. But there was something different about his fire now. It moved with a purpose that went beyond simple heat and destruction. The first indication of how different this battle would be came when one of the CP-0 dreadnoughts fired what looked like a normal cannon volley. Instead of exploding on impact, the projectiles released a strange mist that made Devil Fruit users stagger. Seastone particles, Robin called out as her powers flickered. They're weaponizing Seastone. Everyone with Devil Fruit powers fall back, Marco ordered, but his voice was strained. Even his Phoenix flames were dimming in the artificial fog. That's when Luffy surprised everyone. Instead of retreating, he charged directly into the Seastone mist. His awakened body twisted and flowed through the particles like they were nothing more than morning dew. How is that possible? Someone shouted. Because it's not just a devil fruit anymore, Rayleigh's voice crackled through the Den Den Mushi. The Nika power transcends normal devil fruit limitations. It's something else entirely. GOMU no Dawn Storm, Luffy's attack didn't just dispel the Seastone mist, it transformed it. The particles that had been suppressing devil fruit powers suddenly began enhancing them instead. Ace's flames roared higher, Marco's Phoenix form blazed with renewed intensity, and across the battlefield, their allies felt their powers returning stronger than before. Impossible, came a cold voice from the floating fortress. The Nika awakening shouldn't be able to affect Seastone. The speaker emerged on the fortress's main deck, a figure in elaborate robes that marked him as one of the 5 elders themselves. St. Marcus Mars, his scarred face twisted with fury and disbelief. It's not affecting the Seastone, Luffy called back, his voice carrying impossible distances. It's freeing what the Seastone was suppressing. Nonsense. Devil fruits are curses, limitations imposed by the sea itself. No, Luffy replied, his body beginning to shift into that liquid-light state. They're possibilities. And you've spent 800 years teaching people to be afraid of their own potential. The second wave of attacks came from 3 directions simultaneously. Marine ships from the north, CP-0 vessels from the south, and the floating fortress from the east. It should have been overwhelming. Instead, it became a demonstration of how much the Liberation Alliance had grown. Zoro met the Marine assault head-on, but his swordsmanship had evolved beyond anything he'd shown before. His blades didn't just cut through attacks, they cut through the very concept of being unable to defend his crew. When a battleship fired a full broadside at the Sunny, Zoro's counterattack split not just the cannonballs, but the space between them and their target. Santoryu, his voice carried the same impossible weight as Luffy's. World-cutting stream, the technique carved through reality itself, creating a barrier of severed space that nothing could pass through. Meanwhile, Marco discovered that his Phoenix Flames could do more than heal and burn. Under the pressure of protecting dozens of allied ships, his power evolved in real time. "Phoenix Rising," he cried out, and his flames became something beyond fire. They became renewal itself. Ships that had been damaged were instantly restored. Injured fighters found themselves not just healed, but stronger than before. The very sea around them began to sparkle with rejuvenating energy. But it was Ace who surprised everyone the most. Facing down the floating fortress and its impossible firepower, he didn't just use his Mira Mira no Mi fruit. He pushed beyond it, tapping into something deeper, the will that had kept him alive through torture, through despair, through watching his father figure die. "Entei," he roared, but the miniature sun that emerged was unlike anything he'd ever created. It wasn't just fire, it was the concept of burning away everything false, everything corrupt, everything that stood between people and freedom. The attack struck the fortress's shields and didn't just break them, it convinced them they didn't want to exist anymore. "This is impossible," St. Marcus Mars snarled as his supposedly impregnable defenses crumbled like paper. "These are just pirates, children playing with powers they don't understand." "Maybe that's the problem," came an unexpected voice. Admiral Fujitora descended from the sky, but he wasn't leading a marine assault. He was alone, his sword drawn, his blind eyes fixed on the floating fortress. "Admiral Fujitora," Mars's voice was incredulous. "What are you doing here? You should be leading the eastern assault." "I resigned," Fujitora replied simply, "effective immediately. You can't resign in the middle of a battle. Watch me." Fujitora raised his sword, and the gravity around the fortress intensified until the floating castle began to sink toward the waves. "I joined the Marines to protect people, but you're not interested in protection anymore, are you? We're interested in order, in stability. You're interested in control." Fujitora's power pressed down harder. "And I'm done helping you maintain it." The battle shifted again as more Marine ships suddenly turned their guns on each other. Smoker's gruff voice came through the communication channels. "This is Captain Smoker of the G-5 Marines. Any Marine who remembers what justice actually means, follow my lead." The three-way battle became a four-way conflict as the Marine forces split, with roughly half following Smoker and Fujitora into open rebellion against their own command structure. But the chaos was far from over. "New contacts," the lookout screamed. "East by southeast, multiple large signatures." What appeared on the horizon made everyone, Marine, pirate, and government agent alike, go cold with dread. Two massive ships, each one flying a Yonko flag. Big Mom's Queen Mama Chanter and Kaido's dragon-headed warship, approaching fast with full battle formations. "Oh, come on," Nami groaned. "Really? Right now, this is bad," Marco muttered. "We can't fight the world government and two Yonko at the same time." But Luffy was grinning. "Who says we're fighting them?" he asked, his awakened senses picking up something the others had missed. The two Yonko ships didn't attack when they reached the battlefield. Instead, they positioned themselves between the Liberation Alliance and the government forces, their massive guns trained on the CP-0 dreadnoughts. "Straw Hat," Big Mom's voice boomed across the water. "You owe me a debt, and I owe Kaido a rematch," Luffy called back. "But not today." "Smart answer, kid," Kaido's roar was equally loud. "Because today, we've got bigger fish to fry." "You see," Big Mom continued, her voice taking on a dangerous edge, "someone's been sending assassins after our crews. Government assassins. And we take that very personally." The floating fortress's weapons swiveled toward the new arrivals, but St. Marcus Mars hesitated. Fighting the Liberation Alliance was one thing, fighting two Yonko simultaneously was suicide. "This is temporary," he declared. "We'll deal with you terrorists after we've handled the bigger threats." "No," Luffy said, his voice carrying that resonant quality that made reality bend around it. "You won't." His awakening surged, but instead of attacking, he did something unprecedented. His power reached out, not to harm or control, but to connect. To every person in the battle who had ever felt oppressed, constrained, limited by someone else's idea of what they should be. Marine soldiers who joined to protect people felt it. Pirates who'd taken to the seas for freedom felt it. Even some of the CP0 agents felt it, a memory of what it was like to choose for themselves. "What are you doing?" Mars demanded as his own forces began to hesitate. "Giving everyone a choice," Luffy replied. The same choice Joy Boy wanted to give 800 years ago. The battle paused as an impossible silence fell over the water. In that silence, people remembered things they'd forgotten, dreams they'd abandoned, freedoms they'd surrendered, hopes they'd buried. And then, one by one, they began to choose. Marine soldiers laid down their weapons. CP0 agents removed their masks. Even some of the government administrators looked at their orders and realized they couldn't follow them anymore. "This is mutiny," Mars screamed. "This is treason. This is freedom," Fujitora interrupted calmly. "And it's long overdue." But the Five Elder wasn't finished. As his forces deserted him, as his impossible fortress began to sink, as everything the world government had built to control the world crumbled around him, St. Marcus Mars reached for a communication device. "Activate Uranus," he commanded. The words sent a chill through everyone who heard them. "Sir," came the reply, "Uranus is still in testing phase. We don't know if activate it now." High above, something stirred in the clouds. Something ancient, powerful, and utterly terrifying. "Everyone off the water," Sabo screamed. Now, but it was too late. The sky split open like a wound, and something that belonged in nightmares descended toward the battlefield. "So," Big Mom said with grim satisfaction, "they're finally showing their true face." "About time," Kaido agreed. "I was getting bored with their pretense of civilization." Luffy looked up at the thing emerging from the clouds, ancient weapon Uranus, the government's ultimate trump card, and felt his awakening respond with something deeper than power. "With certainty, you know what," he said, his hair shifting fully white as his transformation reached new heights. "I'm done being afraid of what they might do." His voice carried across the battlefield, reaching every person who'd ever dreamed of being free. "It's time to end this, all of it. 800 years of lies, 800 years of control, 800 years of teaching people to be small and scared and grateful for scraps." The drums of liberation began to beat in rhythm with his heartbeat. "It's time for the dawn." Ancient weapon Uranus was not what anyone expected. Instead of some massive cannon or floating fortress, what descended from the clouds was something organic, a writhing mass of metal and flesh that pulsed with its own malevolent heartbeat. It looked like someone had taken a sea king, fused it with a warship, and taught it to hate everything that moved. "What the hell is that thing?" Frankie shouted, his usual mechanical confidence shaken by the sight. "That," Robin said, her face pale as she consulted the stolen documents, "is what happens when you spend 800 years trying to create the perfect weapon against freedom itself." The creature, because despite its mechanical parts, it was definitely alive, opened what might have been a mouth and released a sound that wasn't quite a roar and wasn't quite a scream. The noise hit the water like a physical force, sending waves rippling outward in perfect geometric patterns. "It's targeting devil fruit users," Marco observed as several pirates on nearby ships collapsed. "But not just weakening them, it's trying to sever their connection to their powers entirely." Luffy felt it too, a tugging sensation, like something was trying to pull his awakening out through his skin. But instead of weakening him, the assault seemed to make his power angry. GOMU no." His voice carried that impossible resonance, but now there was something else underneath it, something that sounded like drums. "Dawn Defiance." His fist stretched toward Uranus, but instead of a normal punch, his attack became something else entirely. Where it struck the creature, reality seemed to laugh. Not audibly, but in a way that made everyone watching feel suddenly lighter, freer, more alive. Uranus recoiled like it had been burned. "Impossible," St. Marcus Mars snarled from his sinking fortress. "Uranus was designed specifically to counter the Nika fruit." "Yeah, well," Luffy grinned, his hair now permanently white and flowing like liquid starlight, "maybe your designers didn't account for me not caring about their rules." That's when the sky above them tore open again. What emerged this time wasn't another weapon, it was a person. A figure in a long coat that billowed in winds that touched nothing else, descending toward the battlefield with the slow inevitability of fate itself. "Oh shit," Big Mom breathed, and coming from her, that was saying something. The figure landed on the water without making a splash, walking across the waves like they were solid ground. As they drew closer, details became visible, ancient scars, eyes that held the weight of centuries, and an aura of absolute authority that made even the Yonko take a step back. "Imsama," Robin whispered, the documents trembling in her hands. I am the secret ruler of the world government, the person who'd sat on the empty throne for 800 years, had finally decided to handle things personally. You, they said, and their voice was like the sound of stars dying. You are the one who woke up. It wasn't really a question. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, he replied simply. And yeah, I woke up. Question is, what are you gonna do about it? What I should have done 8 centuries ago, I am replied, raising one hand. The attack that followed wasn't like anything anyone had ever seen. It wasn't an explosion or a beam of energy. It was the concept of erasure itself, aimed directly at Luffy's existence. But Luffy didn't dodge. He couldn't dodge because the attack wasn't aimed at where he was, it was aimed at where he had ever been or ever could be. Instead, he laughed. The sound that came out of him wasn't entirely human. It was the sound of Joy Boy's laughter, echoing across 800 years of suppression. It was the sound of every person who'd ever refused to give up their dreams. It was the sound of freedom itself, refusing to be silenced. I Am's attack struck that laughter and simply stopped. Not blocked, not deflected, just stopped, as if it had suddenly realized it didn't want to exist anymore. What? I Am's composure cracked for the first time in centuries. That's impossible. Nothing can resist absolute erasure. Maybe your problem, Luffy said, his awakened form now radiating light that made the sun look dim, is that you keep thinking in terms of absolute anything. GOMU no dawn liberation. This attack was different from anything Luffy had done before. Instead of stretching or bouncing or any of the traditional rubber properties, his power simply convinced things to be free. The water around I Am started to rebel against gravity. The air began to dance in patterns that ignored the laws of physics. Even the light itself started moving in spirals, as if it had decided straight lines were too boring. And Uranus, the perfect weapon designed to counter the Nika fruit, looked at itself and realized it didn't want to be a weapon anymore. The creature's anguished cry shook the heavens as it began to tear apart its own mechanical components, trying to free the organic parts that had been enslaved to serve destruction. "What are you doing to my weapon?" I Am demanded. "I'm not doing anything to it," Luffy replied. "I'm just reminding it that it has a choice." That's when the real chaos began. Across the battlefield, every person who'd ever been forced into service, Marine soldiers following orders they didn't believe in, government agents carrying out missions that violated their consciences, even the enslaved parts of Uranus itself, suddenly remembered what it felt like to choose. The results were immediate and devastating to the world government's control structure. "Sir," came panicked voices through I Am's communication device, "we're getting reports from across the globe. Bases going dark, agents defecting, entire fleets abandoning their posts." "How is that possible?" I Am snarled. "The range of devil fruit powers is limited. The Nika awakening isn't just affecting this battlefield," Robin realized, her eyes wide with understanding. "It's affecting everyone everywhere who's ever felt the weight of oppression." "That's impossible," St. Marcus Mars protested from his rapidly sinking fortress. "No power is that extensive. No devil fruit power is that extensive," Sabo corrected, his own flames dancing with renewed vigor. "But what if it's not just a devil fruit anymore? What if it's something bigger?" "The will of D," Rayleigh's voice crackled through the Den Mushi. Roger was right. It was never about individual power, it was about inherited will. And that boy just inherited the will of everyone who ever refused to give up. I Am's expression grew darker. "Then I'll simply have to erase that will along with everything else." Their next attack was aimed not at Luffy, but at the sea itself. If they couldn't destroy the source of liberation, they'd destroy the world that might be liberated. But before the attack could land, someone unexpected intervened. "That's enough, Monkey D." Garp descended from the clouds, his fists crackling with haki so intense it was visible from miles away. But there was something different about him. A weight, a sadness, and underneath it all, a fury that had been building for decades. "Garp," I Am said coldly, "you're supposed to be hunting your grandson, not protecting him." "I've spent my whole life following orders," Garp replied, landing on the water between I Am and Luffy. "Following a system I believed in. But watching what you've become, what you've turned my Marines into," he cracked his knuckles and the sound was like thunder. "Some things are more important than orders. You would betray everything you've sworn to protect." "I'm protecting what I swore to protect," Garp said simply. "I'm protecting the future." The battle that followed between Garp and I Am was like watching two forces of nature collide. Garp's hockey-enhanced fists met I Am's reality-warping attacks in explosions that lit up the sky. But everyone could see that Garp was outmatched, not in skill or determination, but in raw power. I am had 800 years of accumulated authority, while Garp was just one old man with a conscience. But he wasn't fighting alone. Phoenix Regeneration Field, Marco's flames erupted across the battlefield, but instead of just healing, they began to restore things to what they should be. Damaged ships became whole. Injured fighters found their strength renewed. Even the ocean itself began to sparkle with renewed life. Mera Nova. Ace's fire joined Marco's flames, but his attack was aimed directly at the conceptual bonds holding Uranus together. Where his flames touched the creature, the organic and mechanical parts began to separate, not violently, but gently, like a chain that had decided it was tired of holding. Sahntohruy's secret technique. Zoro's swords moved in patterns that cut through more than just physical space. They cut through the very idea that freedom could be contained. Infinity severance, but it was Big Mom and Kaido who delivered the real surprise. Soul liberation. Big Mom's power, instead of stealing souls, began freeing them. Every person on the battlefield who'd ever had their spirit crushed by authority felt their inner fire rekindle. Freedom thunder. Kaido's lightning didn't just destroy, it broke chains. Literal chains, metaphorical chains, the invisible chains of fear and doubt that had held people down for centuries. What is this? I am demanded as their perfect order began to crumble on all sides. You're all just pirates. Criminals, you can't possibly coordinate like this. We're not coordinating, Luffy said, his awakened form now radiating power that made the air itself sing with possibility. We're just all choosing the same thing, which is freedom. The word hit Iam like a physical blow, and for the first time in 8 centuries, they staggered. That's when the real revelation came. You're afraid, Luffy said, and his voice carried not mockery, but understanding. You've been afraid for 800 years. That's why you destroyed the ancient kingdom. That's why you erased Joy Boy from history. That's why you've spent centuries making sure no one could make the same choice he made. I am not afraid, Iam snarled, but there was something hollow in their voice now. Yeah, you are. You're afraid that if people get to choose, they won't choose you. Around them, the battle was winding down, not because the fighting had stopped, but because there were fewer and fewer people willing to fight for the world government's vision of order. Uranus had completely separated into its component parts, the organic Sea King swimming away gratefully, while the mechanical parts sank harmlessly into the depths. St. Marcus Mars's fortress had finally succumbed to Fuji Tora's gravity, sending the 5 Elder into the drink. Across the world, according to frantic reports coming through the communication channels, government installations were surrendering or simply abandoning their posts. This isn't over, Iam said, but they were already beginning to fade, using some kind of transportation ability to retreat. 800 years of order cannot be overturned by one boy with rubber powers. Maybe not, Luffy agreed, but it can be overturned by everyone who remembers what it feels like to laugh. As Iam disappeared, taking the immediate threat with them, the battlefield fell into an exhausted quiet. The sun was setting, painting the churned waters gold and red. So, Big Mom said, breaking the silence. What now, Straw Hat? Luffy looked around at the assembled forces, pirates and marines, revolutionaries and defectors, people who had nothing in common except the choice they'd all made to stand up for freedom. Now we finish it, he said simply. We go to Marineford, we find the rest of them, and we make sure this never happens again. That's suicide, someone protested. Marineford is the most fortified place in the world. So was Enies Lobby, Robin pointed out. So was Impel Down. So was this battlefield, until we decided it wasn't. Besides, Ace added with a grin that reminded everyone why the brothers were related, since when has impossible ever stopped us before? As night fell and the various crews began making plans for the final assault, none of them noticed the small mechanical spy devices that had been recording everything. In Marineford, the remaining 4 elders watched the footage with expressions of growing desperation. Uranus failed, one said flatly. Im-sama retreated, another added. And our global control structure is collapsing faster than we can contain it. So what do? There was a long pause before the eldest spoke. We activate the final protocol. The one we swore we'd never use. Are you insane? If we don't do that, everything we've built for 800 years disappears forever. Another pause, longer this time. Authorization code void century. Emergency Protocol 0. In the deepest vaults beneath Marineford, something ancient and terrible began to stir. The world government had one last card to play, and this time they were willing to destroy the world to keep it. The red line had stood for millennia as an unbreachable wall dividing the world's oceans. Today, it was about to learn what happened when unstoppable force met immovable object. The Liberation Alliance fleet stretched across the horizon, over 200 ships representing every corner of the world. Pirates who'd never worked together, Marines who'd abandoned their posts, revolutionary army vessels that had finally emerged from the shadows, and civilian craft carrying people who'd simply decided they were tired of being afraid. At the center of it all, the Thousand Sunny rode the waves like it was born for this moment. "Status report," Luffy called out, though his voice carried that otherworldly resonance that made everyone feel like they could conquer the world. "Revolutionary Army forces in position," Sabo replied through the Den Mushi. "Dragon sends his regards, by the way. He's always wanted to meet you properly." "Defected Marine units ready," Smoker's gruff voice added. "Though I still think this is the craziest thing I've ever been part of." "Yonko fleet standing by," came Big Mom's booming laugh. "This should be fun. Whitebeard remnants ready to make Pops proud," Marco said, phoenix flames dancing around his transformed body. Luffy looked up at the red line towering above them, its cliff face seeming to stretch into the clouds themselves. Somewhere up there, beyond the ancient stone, lay Marineford, the Holy Land, seat of world government power, home to secrets that had been buried for 800 years. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've always hated walls." Gomu no. His awakened power surged, but instead of attacking the cliff directly, he did something unprecedented. Dawn Ascension, his body stretched not just physically but conceptually, reaching up the cliff face while somehow carrying the entire fleet with him. Not lifting them, but convincing space itself that they belonged at the top of the red line. "That's impossible," Nami breathed as she felt the Sunny rising through the air without any visible means of support. "Everything we do is impossible," Zoro pointed out. "That's kind of our thing." As the fleet crested the red line's edge, Mary Geoise spread out before them in all its impossible splendor. Crystal towers that caught and reflected light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Gardens that bloomed with flowers from every climate on Earth. And at the center of it all, Pangaea Castle, the seat of power that had ruled the world for 8 centuries. It was beautiful, in the way that cages were beautiful to people who'd forgotten what freedom looked like. "Welcome to Mary Geoise," came a cold voice from the city's edge. "Though I'm afraid visiting hours are over." Admiral Akainu stood at the head of a formation that stretched across the Holy Land's entrance. Not just Marines, but CP agents, government officials, and soldiers wearing uniforms that nobody recognized. Behind them, the spires of Mary Geoise gleamed with an inner light that suggested hidden weapons. "Sakazuki," Ace said quietly, flames already dancing around his fists. "Fire fist." Akainu's magma began to bubble and flow. "Still alive, I see. Don't worry, I'll correct that oversight." "You tried that once already," Ace replied, his fire burning brighter than it ever had before. "How'd that work out for you?" The confrontation that had been building since Marineford was finally here, but this time everything was different. Ace wasn't a prisoner facing execution. He was a free man fighting for his family. Akainu wasn't backed by the moral authority of the Marines. He was serving masters who'd revealed their true nature. Meteor Volcano. Akainu's attack filled the sky with molten projectiles, but these weren't aimed just at Ace. They were targeting the entire fleet. Nova Barrier, Ace countered, his flames meeting the magma in midair. But where before his fire had been overwhelmed, now it held firm. More than that, it began to push back. "Impossible," Akainu snarled. "Your fire is just fire." "Magma is superior." "Maybe," Ace agreed, his flames shifting from orange to blue to white-hot intensity. "But fire is freedom. And magma." His next attack blazed with the accumulated fury of everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter. "Magma is just earth that forgot how to be solid." Freedom Flame Emperor. The attack that followed wasn't just fire, it was liberation itself, burning away everything false and leaving only truth behind. Where it struck Akainu's magma, the molten rock began to cool and solidify, remembering what it was like to be stable ground instead of liquid destruction. But that was just one battle among dozens. Across the Holy Land's entrance, the Liberation Alliance clashed with the world government's last defenders. Zoro's swords carved through formations of CP agents like they were cutting concepts rather than people. Marco's Phoenix Flames turned the battlefield into a field of renewal, where every ally who fell was immediately restored to fighting strength. But it was the arrival of the Revolutionary Army's full force that truly changed the game. Wind Revolution, Dragon, leader of the Revolutionary Army and Luffy's father, descended from the sky like a living hurricane. His powers had always been formidable, but now they carried the weight of decades of preparation for this exact moment. Where his winds touched the government forces, weapons simply stopped working. Not broken, just convinced that they didn't want to be weapons anymore. "Dragon," Luffy called out as his father landed nearby. "Took you long enough? I wanted to make sure you were ready," Dragon replied, his usually serious expression softened by something that might have been paternal pride. "Looks like you are." "Father and son," Akainu sneered, momentarily breaking off his battle with Ace. "How touching, I'll kill you both together." "You'll try," Dragon replied calmly. Then to Luffy, "The others are already inside. Robin's team is moving toward the archives while Sabo's people are securing the communication centers. What about the 5 elders? Waiting for you in Pangaea Castle." Dragon's expression grew grim. "Along with whatever emergency Protocol Zero turns out to be." As if summoned by his words, the castle at Mary Geoise's heart began to glow with an ominous light. Not the warm gold of sunlight, but something cold and hungry that seemed to devour the very air around it. "That doesn't look good," Chopper observed with masterful understatement. "Nothing they do looks good," Luffy replied, his awakened form beginning to shift toward something even more evolved. "That's why we're here." The glow from Pangaea Castle intensified, and suddenly the air itself began to feel heavy. Not with gravity, with authority, with 8 centuries of accumulated power pressing down on everyone who dared to challenge it. "All units fall back," came panicked voices from the government forces. "Protocol Zero is active." "Repeat, Protocol Zero is active." "What's Protocol Zero?" Nami shouted over the rising wind. Robin's voice crackled through the Den Mushi from somewhere inside the city. "According to the documents, it's not a weapon. It's a summoning." "Summoning what?" "The original authority, the power that created the world government 800 years ago." The castle's glow reached critical intensity, and then something emerged from its highest tower. Not a person, not a weapon, but an idea given form, the concept of absolute rule made manifest. It looked like a crown floating in empty air, but as it rose higher, reality began to warp around it. The very notion of disobedience started to feel impossible. The idea of resistance began to seem foolish. "That's," Fujitora breathed, his usually calm demeanor cracking, "that's the crown of kings. The authority that makes all other authority possible." "Kneel," the crown spoke, and its voice was the sound of every law ever written, every command ever given, every chain ever forged. "You will kneel before legitimate authority." Across the battlefield, people began to drop to their knees. Not from choice, but because the very concept of standing in defiance of ultimate power had temporarily forgotten how to exist. Everyone except Luffy. "You know what?" he said, his awakened form now blazing with light that made the crown's authority look dim by comparison. "I don't think I will. Gomu no." His voice carried the weight of every person who'd ever refused to bow, every dream that had survived oppression, every laugh that had echoed in the face of tyranny. Dawn Revolution. This attack didn't target the crown directly. Instead, it targeted the idea that any authority could be absolute. Where Luffy's power touched the world, people remembered that they had choices. That power came from consent, not force. That even kings were just people who'd convinced others to follow them. The crown's influence wavered as millions of people across the world suddenly remembered what it felt like to stand up straight. "Impossible," came the voice of Saint Ethenbaron V. Nusjuro from the castle below. "The crown of kings cannot be defied. It is the source of all legitimate rule." "Maybe that's the problem," Luffy replied, his awakening now affecting not just the physical world but the conceptual one. "Maybe there's no such thing as legitimate rule. Maybe there's just people choosing to work together or people choosing to fight." "Anarchist," Saint Topman Warcury's voice boomed from another tower. "You would destroy civilization itself." "Nah," Luffy grinned, his power continuing to erode the crown's absolute authority. "I'm gonna replace it with something better, which is people being free to choose for themselves." The battle for Mary Geoise raged on, but the fundamental nature of the conflict had changed. It was no longer about defeating the world government's military forces. It was about defeating the very idea that anyone had the right to rule over others without their consent. And slowly, impossibly, that idea was losing. "Sir," came frantic reports to the remaining 5 elders. "Global communication blackouts, revolution in 12 kingdoms, marine bases surrendering across all 4 seas." "It's not just happening here," Saint Shepherd Jupiter realized with growing horror. "His power is affecting the entire world. Every person who's ever felt the weight of unjust authority is remembering what it feels like to say no." Then we use the final option, St. J. Garcia Saturn declared. Release the void. Are you insane? If we do that, if we don't do that, everything ends anyway. At least this way we can start over. Deep beneath Pangaea Castle, in chambers that predated the world government itself, ancient seals began to crack. Something that had been imprisoned for 800 years stirred in its eternal darkness. And somewhere in the deepest archives of Mary Geoise, Robin discovered the final truth about the Void Century, and why the world government was so desperate to keep it hidden. Luffy, she said urgently into her Den Mushi, I know what they're going to do, and we need to get everyone off this island right now. But it was already too late. The seals shattered completely, and darkness began to pour out of the earth like a living thing. The world government's final gambit wasn't a weapon, it was the opposite of existence itself. The void wasn't darkness, it was the absence of light ever having existed. It poured from the broken seals beneath Pangaea Castle like liquid nothingness, consuming everything it touched. Not destroying things, but convincing reality that they had never been real in the first place. Everyone back, Luffy shouted, but his voice was already being muffled by the spreading emptiness. Get to the ships, we can't outrun this, Dragon observed with the calm of someone who'd spent his life preparing for impossible situations. It's not moving, it's expanding the concept of never having been. Robin's voice crackled through the Den Mushi, strained with the effort of reading while running. The archives, they explain everything. The Void Century wasn't a missing 100 years, it was a period when existence itself was under attack. What the hell does that mean? Ace demanded, his flames flickering uncertainly as they encountered the edge of the void. It means, came Iam's voice from everywhere and nowhere, that some problems require permanent solutions. I am materialized not from the shadows, but from the growing emptiness itself. They look different now, older, more tired, but also more desperate. 8 centuries of maintaining absolute control had worn them down to the bone. You're insane, Sabo breathed, his pipe crackling with revolutionary fire. You're willing to destroy the world just to maintain power. Not destroy, I am corrected, their voice carrying the weight of geological ages. Restart. Begin again with better parameters this time. The void, Robin continued reading, her voice growing more urgent. It's not a weapon, it's a reset button. It unravels existence back to the point where choices can be made again. And this time, Iam said, raising their hand toward the spreading nothingness, I'll make sure the right choices are made. The void expanded faster, reaching toward the Liberation Alliance fleet. Where it touched the red line's edge, the ancient stone didn't crumble, it simply ceased to have ever been carved from the sea floor. That's when Luffy did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He laughed. Not his usual carefree chuckle, but something deeper. Something that sounded like 800 years of suppressed joy finally breaking free. You know what's really funny, he said, his awakened form beginning to shift into something unprecedented. You spent all this time trying to control everything, and you never figured out the most important thing about freedom. Which is, Iam demanded, their patience finally cracking. You can't destroy it, Luffy replied, his hair now flowing like liquid starlight. Because it's not a thing, it's a choice. And as long as people can choose, freedom exists. Gomu no. His voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with reality itself. Ultimate Dawn, what happened next broke every rule of devil fruit powers that had ever been written. Luffy's awakening didn't just affect his body, or the battlefield, or even the world. It reached back through time itself, touching every moment when someone had chosen freedom over security, hope over despair, laughter over tears. The void, designed to unravel existence back to controllable parameters, met something that had always existed and always would exist, the human capacity to choose. And the void blinked first. Impossible, Iam breathed as their ultimate weapon began to retreat. The void unmakes everything. It's the opposite of creation itself. Maybe, Luffy agreed, his transformed body now radiating light that seemed to come from every person who'd ever dreamed of being free. But choice isn't something that gets created or destroyed, it just is. That's not how power works. Says who? Luffy's grin could have lit up the night. You, the same person who's been so scared of people making their own choices that you spent 8 centuries hiding the truth. I am the truth, Iam roared, their composure finally shattering completely. I am order, I am stability. I am the authority that makes civilization possible. No, came a new voice from the retreating void. Everyone turned to see a figure emerging from the nothingness tall, wearing a straw hat that looked remarkably familiar, with a smile that could have been Luffy's ancestor. Joy Boy, Robin whispered. Actually, the figure said, tipping his hat, the name's Joy Boy, one word, but close enough. He looked exactly like what Luffy might become in 20 years, older, more weathered, but carrying the same unshakable faith in people's essential goodness. How? I am staggered backward. You're dead, I killed you, I erased you from history itself. You erased me from the records, Joyboy corrected gently. But you can't erase laughter from people's hearts. And every time someone laughed in the face of tyranny, every time someone chose to help a stranger, every time someone stood up for what was right. He gestured toward Luffy. I was still there. This is impossible, St. Marcus Mars's voice came from the castle, where the remaining 5 elders had barricaded themselves. The past cannot be changed. The past can't be changed, Luffy agreed, his power now harmonizing with Joyboy's across the centuries. But its meaning can be, you spent 800 years trying to make people forget that they had choices, but we're here to remind them. I am demanded. Luffy gestured around the battlefield, where the Liberation Alliance stood ready despite the impossible situation. Pirates and Marines, revolutionaries and civilians, people who had nothing in common except their refusal to bow down. All of us, Luffy said simply. Everyone who ever decided that freedom was worth fighting for. The battle that followed wasn't like anything that had come before. It wasn't about physical strength or devil fruit powers. It was about fundamental concepts colliding. I am fought with the accumulated authority of 8 centuries, wielding the power of absolute rule like a weapon. Every attack carried the weight of laws and traditions, and the crushing certainty that resistance was futile. Luffy and Joyboy fought with something simpler but infinitely more powerful, the knowledge that people deserved to be free, and that freedom was something worth dying for. Authority absolute, Iam's attack tried to convince everyone present that they had no choice but to obey. Liberation infinite, Luffy and Joyboy's combined response reminded everyone that they always had a choice, no matter how small. Where the attacks met, reality itself trembled. The very concept of rule by force warred with the idea of cooperation by choice. And slowly, impossibly, choice began to win. You don't understand, Iam pleaded as their 800 years of accumulated power began to crack. Without authority, there is only chaos. Without order, civilization collapses. Maybe, Joyboy admitted. But maybe that's not such a bad thing if the civilization was built on lies. People need to be guided. They need to be protected from their own poor decisions. People need to be free to make poor decisions, Luffy said firmly. That's what makes the good decisions meaningful. But the suffering, the wars, the mistakes are still better than chains, Luffy replied, because at least they're ours. Iam's power cracked, then shattered, then dissolved like sugar in rain. 8 centuries of absolute authority crumbled in the face of one simple truth. That power which required force to maintain wasn't really power at all. No, Iam whispered as they began to fade. Without me, without the government, who will maintain order, who will protect the peace? We will, Luffy said simply, all of us together. You can't, you're just pirates, criminals. Children playing at being heroes. Yeah, Luffy grinned, isn't it great? As I am finally dissolved into nothingness, not destroyed, but simply choosing to let go of a burden they'd carried for too long, the void began to retreat. Reality reasserted itself with a sound like the world's biggest party. So, Joyboy said, turning to his successor. What now? Luffy looked around at the battlefield, at Mary Geoi's crumbling as 8 centuries of oppressive architecture decided it didn't want to exist anymore, at the thousands of people who'd chosen freedom over security. Now we go home, he said, and we let people know that they get to choose what comes next. Just like that, Luffy's grin was infectious. The world's gonna be messy for a while, people are gonna make mistakes. Some places might even have wars. And you're okay with that? I'm okay with it being their choice, Luffy replied. That's what freedom means, the right to be wrong. As the sun rose over the ruins of the world government's final stronghold, the Liberation Alliance stood victorious. Not because they'd conquered anyone, but because they'd reminded the world that conquest wasn't necessary. One question, Ace said as the various crews began preparing for departure. What about all the people who worked for the government? The Marines, the administrators, they get to choose too, Luffy interrupted. Some of them will keep trying to control people, some of them will choose to help people instead, and some of them will just go fishing. He shrugged. That's their call. As Joyboy began to fade, his purpose finally fulfilled after 8 centuries, he left them with one last piece of wisdom. The dawn doesn't end the night forever, he said. Somewhere someday people will try to put chains on freedom again. When that happens, we'll be ready, Luffy promised. No, Joyboy smiled. Your kids will be, and their kids, and their kids. Because that's what freedom really is, Not something you win once and keep forever, but something every generation has to choose for themselves. The liberation of the world was complete. Now came the hard part, figuring out what to do with it. 6 weeks after the fall of Marineford, the world was learning that freedom was a lot messier than anyone had expected. "Status report," Luffy called out from his position on the Sunny's figurehead, though his voice lacked its usual carefree energy. The past month and a half had taught him that winning a war was easier than managing its aftermath. 12 more kingdoms have declared independence from any centralized authority, Robin replied, consulting a stack of newspapers that grew thicker every day. 3 civil wars have broken out in former world government territories. And there's been a 70% increase in piracy across all 4 seas. "The good kind of piracy or the bad kind?" Chopper asked hopefully. "Both," Robin said grimly. "Turns out when you remove all authority structures, some people choose to help others and some people choose to rob them." Luffy nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. This was the part Joy Boy hadn't talked much about, what happened when you gave everyone the freedom to choose, and some of them chose badly. "Any word from the others?" he asked. "Ace and Marco are helping establish the new marine structure under Admiral Fujitora and Smoker," Nami reported, flipping through her own correspondence. "They're trying to create something that protects people without oppressing them, but it's complicated. Sabo's Revolutionary Army is providing disaster relief in areas where government infrastructure collapsed," Frankie added. "But they're spread pretty thin. And Dragon officially disbanded the Revolutionary Army 3 days ago," Robin said with a slight smile. "He said their revolution was complete, now it was up to everyone else to figure out what came next." The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on all their shoulders. They'd torn down 8 centuries of control, but building something better was proving infinitely more challenging than anyone had anticipated. "Captain," Brook's voice drifted from the crow's nest, "we're approaching Logtown, and there's quite a crowd waiting for us." Luffy looked ahead to see what Brook meant. The harbor town where the Pirate King had been executed was packed with people, not just townspeople, but representatives from across the world. Banners flew from dozens of different kingdoms, revolutionary groups, newly formed organizations, and more than a few that were completely unidentifiable. "Looks like that meeting we've been avoiding is finally happening whether we want it or not," Zoro observed. They'd been getting requests for weeks. Kingdoms wanting Luffy to be their king, organizations wanting the Straw Hats to lead the New World Order, groups begging for guidance on how to structure their newfound freedom. All requests that Luffy had politely declined, much to the confusion of people who couldn't understand why someone with the power to rule the world wouldn't want to. "All right," Luffy said, standing up and stretching. "Let's go see what they want." "And if they ask you to become the world king again?" Sanji asked, lighting a cigarette. "Same thing I told them last time," Luffy replied with a grin that was only slightly strained. "I don't want to be anyone's king, I just want to be free." The crowd that greeted them at Logtown's dock was unlike anything they'd ever seen. Kings and revolutionaries stood next to each other, former world government officials mingled with pirates, and in the center of it all, a familiar figure waited with a patient smile. "Yo, Luffy," Shanks called out as the Straw Hats disembarked. "Fancy meeting you here." "Shanks," Luffy's face lit up for the first time in weeks. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing everyone else is doing," the red-haired Yonko replied. "Trying to figure out what the hell we're supposed to do now that you've broken the world." "I didn't break it," Luffy protested. "I just removed the chains. And now everyone's trying to figure out how to walk without them," said a new voice. They turned to see Rebecca approaching, but she wasn't alone. King Riku walked beside her, along with representatives from Dressrosa, Alabasta, Fishman Island, and a dozen other kingdoms that had been liberated by the Straw Hats over the years. "Princess Rebecca," Robin nodded respectfully. "King Riku, it's good to see you both." "The question," King Riku said without preamble, "is what we do now. The world government is gone, but people still need protection, trade routes still need to be secured, and laws still need to be enforced." "So enforce them," Luffy said simply. "You don't need permission to protect your people. But we do need coordination," Rebecca replied gently. "Alabasta can't handle pirates attacking Drum Island. Fishman Island can't manage trade disputes between surface kingdoms. We need some kind of structure." "What kind of structure?" Zoro asked, though his hand was already moving toward his swords. He'd been expecting this conversation for weeks. "Not a world government," Vivi said quickly, emerging from the crowd with Karu at her side. "Never that again, but maybe a council. Representatives from different regions who could coordinate responses to major threats." Who would lead this council? Sanji asked. That's what we're here to discuss, Shanks replied. And why everyone keeps asking you, Luffy? Because you're the one who set us free, added King Neptune, his massive form towering over the crowd. People trust you in a way they'll never trust traditional authority again. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, looking around at all the expectant faces. These were good people, people who'd suffered under the world government's rule and were now trying to build something better. But they were also people who wanted someone else to make the hard decisions for them. I have a better idea, he said finally. Why don't you all figure it out together? What do you mean? Rebecca asked. I mean exactly what I said. Luffy hopped up onto a nearby crate so everyone could see him. You want to coordinate between kingdoms? Great. Work it out between yourselves. You want to handle pirates who attack innocent people? Awesome. Band together and handle them. You want to establish trade routes and laws and all that other stuff? He grinned. You're all smart people. I'm sure you can figure it out. But what if we make mistakes? Someone called from the crowd. Then you'll make mistakes, Luffy replied simply, and then you'll figure out how to fix them. That's how freedom works. What if some kingdoms refuse to cooperate? Another voice asked. Then they refuse to cooperate, Luffy shrugged. And you'll have to decide whether that's something you can live with or something you need to do something about. But that's your choice to make, not mine. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. They'd wanted guidance, leadership, someone to tell them what the right answer was. Instead, they were being told to find their own answers. Luffy, King Riku said carefully, people are suffering. In the chaos after the government's fall, entire regions have descended into anarchy. Don't you feel any responsibility for that? The question hit harder than any physical attack could have. Luffy's expression grew serious, and for a moment the weight of 800 years of liberated suffering seemed to settle on his shoulders. Yeah, he said quietly, I do feel responsible for giving people the chance to choose. What they choose with that chance, that's on them. Even if they choose violence, even if they choose to hurt innocent people. Especially then, Luffy replied, his voice gaining strength. Because the alternative is deciding that people can't be trusted to make their own choices. And once you decide that, he gestured toward where Mary Geoise had once stood. You end up building something like what we just tore down. An uncomfortable silence fell over the crowd. So what do we do? Vivi asked softly. We do what people have always done, Luffy replied. We help each other when we can, we protect each other when we must, we forgive each other when we mess up, and we trust that most people, most of the time, will choose to be decent if they're given the chance. And if they don't, then we deal with it. Together, as equals. Luffy looked around at the assembled representatives. Not because someone at the top ordered us to, but because we chose to. The meeting that followed lasted 3 days and accomplished exactly what Luffy had hoped it would, nothing definitive. Instead of creating a new centralized authority, the various kingdoms and organizations agreed to establish a loose network of mutual aid agreements. No single leader, no ultimate authority, no grand plan for how the world should work. Just people agreeing to help each other and figure things out as they went. It's going to be messy, Fujitora observed as the agreements were being finalized. Lots of conflicts, lots of mistakes, lots of suffering that might have been prevented by stronger leadership. Yeah, Luffy agreed. But it'll be their mess, and their victories when they figure out how to clean it up. As the various delegations prepared to depart, Ace approached his brother with an expression that mixed pride and concern. You know they're going to keep asking, right? He said. Every time there's a crisis, every time something goes wrong, people are going to want you to step in and fix it. I know, Luffy replied. And I'm going to keep saying no. Even if people die because of that choice. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, watching the representatives from different kingdoms work together to organize supply chains and mutual defense pacts. Ace, he said finally, how many people died because the world government existed? How many people suffered because someone decided they knew what was best for everyone else? A lot, Ace admitted. And how many people do you think would die if I decided to become the world king, even with the best intentions? Ace didn't answer, but his expression showed he understood. Freedom is messy, Luffy continued. People make bad choices, they hurt each other, they start wars over stupid things, but the alternative, he shook his head. The alternative is deciding that people don't deserve the right to make bad choices. And once you make that decision, you stop being someone who protects people and start being someone who controls them. That evening, as the Straw Hats prepared to leave Logtown, Robin approached Luffy with a final question. Do you ever wonder if Joy Boy struggled with this too? She asked. The weight of having changed everything but not being able to control what came next. Probably, Luffy replied, looking out at the stars. But I think that's the point. Freedom isn't something you give to people like a present. It's something they have to take for themselves and then decide what to do with. And if they decide badly, then they'll have to live with the consequences, Luffy said simply. Same as everyone else. As the Thousand Sunny sailed away from Logtown, the crew settled into a comfortable quiet. Behind them, the world they'd helped liberate continued its messy, chaotic, beautiful journey toward figuring out what freedom actually meant. Ahead of them lay the same thing it always had: adventure, mystery, and the endless possibility of discovery. So, Nami asked as she plotted their course, "Where to next, Captain?" "I don't know," Luffy replied with the first completely carefree grin he'd worn since Mary Geoise fell. Isn't that great? And for the first time in months, everyone agreed that it really, really was. But in the distance, storm clouds were already gathering. Freedom was messy, and somewhere in the chaos of the new world, new threats were beginning to stir. The dawn had come, but morning was going to be a long and complicated affair. 3 months after Logtown, Luffy finally understood what Joyboy had meant about the price of liberation. The call came while they were anchored near a small island in the South Blue, restocking supplies and enjoying what had become an increasingly rare moment of peace. Chopper was the one who answered the emergency Den Den Mushi, his usual cheerful demeanor instantly sobering as he listened. "Luffy," he said quietly, holding out the receiver. "It's Marco. There's been an incident." The Phoenix's voice crackled through with exhaustion and something deeper, grief. "Kid, I need you to sit down for this," Marco said without preamble. "What happened?" Luffy asked, though something cold was already settling in his stomach. "It's Ace." The world seemed to stop spinning. 3 days ago, a group calling themselves the True Government took over a marine base in the North Blue. They had hostages, civilian families, including kids. Ace and his crew responded to the distress call. Luffy's grip on the Den Den Mushi tightened. The bastards had rigged the entire base with explosives. Ace, he got everyone out. All the hostages, all the Marines, even most of his own crew. But someone had to stay behind to make sure the bombs didn't go off early. "No," Nami whispered, her hand covering her mouth. "He saved over 300 people," Marco continued, his voice thick with emotion. But the explosion, there wasn't enough left to. The Den Den Mushi fell from Luffy's nerveless fingers, clattering to the deck. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the Sunny's hull and the distant cry of seabirds. Then Luffy screamed. It wasn't a sound of rage or denial, it was the sound of a soul breaking in real time. His awakened powers surged uncontrolled, and for a terrifying moment reality itself seemed to sob around them. When the echoes finally died away, Luffy was on his knees, staring at nothing. "He was supposed to be free," he whispered. "I saved him, he was supposed to be free." "Luffy," Robin started but stopped when she saw his expression. "What's the point?" Luffy asked, his voice hollow. "What's the point of any of it if the people I care about still die?" It was Zoro who answered, his voice quiet but firm. "The point is that he chose how to die." Everyone turned to look at the swordsman, who was staring out at the horizon with an expression of profound sadness mixed with something that might have been pride. At Marineford, Ace was going to die as a prisoner, for his bloodline, for things he couldn't control. Zoro's hand rested on his sword hilt, not in threat but in comfort. 3 days ago, he died as a free man, saving people. "Making a choice, that's supposed to make it better," Luffy's voice cracked. "No," Zoro replied simply, "it's supposed to make it meaningful." The funeral was held on the Moby Dick, which had become something of a floating monument to Whitebeard's legacy. Pirates came from across the world to pay their respects, not just to Ace, but to what he represented. The brother who'd been saved from execution, only to die saving others. "He was the best of us," Marco said, standing before the simple memorial they'd erected. Not because he was the strongest or the smartest or the most talented, but because when it mattered most, he chose to put other people's lives ahead of his own. "He chose freedom," Sabo added, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "Not just for himself, but for everyone he could reach." Luffy hadn't spoken since they'd arrived. He stood at the memorial's base, his usual energy completely absent, looking older than his 18 years. "This is my fault," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the eulogies. "Luffy, no," Sabo started. "It is." Luffy looked up at the assembled crowd, hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by the liberation of the world. "If I hadn't started this whole thing, if I hadn't awakened that power, if I hadn't convinced everyone that they could be free, Ace would still be alive." And so would the world government, came an unexpected voice from the crowd. Everyone turned to see Smoker pushing through the assembled pirates, his face grim but determined. You want to blame yourself, kid? Fine, but while you're doing that, maybe consider this. He pulled out a thick folder of reports. In the 3 months since Marineford fell, we've documented over 50,000 people who are alive specifically because the old system is gone. What do you mean? Chopper asked. Slaves who were freed when their owners lost government protection. Political prisoners who were released when the old judicial system collapsed. Entire populations that were being systematically oppressed. Smoker's voice grew harder. Hell, in just the last week, the new Marine Coalition prevented 3 separate genocides that the old world government would have ignored or actively supported. But Ace, Luffy started. Ace died because some bastards decided that freedom was a threat to their power, Smoker interrupted. Same as people have been dying for 800 years. The difference is that now, people like Ace can choose to fight back. The words hung in the air like a challenge. You think I don't know the cost, Smoker continued. I've lost friends too, good Marines who died trying to protect people in the chaos after the government fell. But you know what? They died as heroes, not as enforcers of an unjust system. It hurts, VV said quietly, stepping forward. Losing people you care about always hurts, but Luffy, the world you helped create, it's one where people like Ace can exist, where they can choose to be heroes instead of being forced to be victims. She's right, Robin added, her archaeological instincts unable to remain silent. I've been studying the historical records we recovered from Marineford. Do you know how many people died over the centuries just for dreaming of freedom? How many aces never got the chance to save anyone because they were executed for crimes they didn't commit? Luffy was quiet for a long time, processing their words. Does it get easier, he asked finally, knowing that people you care about might die because of choices you made? No, Dragon answered, appearing at his son's side. It doesn't get easier. But it does get more meaningful. How? Because every person who chooses to live freely, every person who chooses to help others, every person who chooses to be brave in the face of tyranny, they're making Ace's sacrifice worthwhile. As the funeral wound down and people began to disperse, Marco approached Luffy with something unexpected, a smile. He left something for you, the Phoenix said, pulling out a letter written in Ace's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, Luffy opened it and began to read, Hey, little brother. If you're reading this, then I probably did something heroically stupid and didn't make it back. Don't blame yourself. You know I was never good at staying out of trouble. I wanted you to know that these last few months since Marineford have been the best of my life. Not because we won some big battle, but because for the first time ever, I got to choose who I wanted to be. For most of my life, I hated existing. I hated being Roger's son. I hated carrying his blood. I hated that people looked at me and saw him instead of me. But you changed that. You showed me that it doesn't matter who your father is. What matters is what you choose to do with your life. So if I'm gone, don't waste time feeling guilty. Instead, keep being the person who shows others that they get to choose too. Keep being the person who laughs in the face of impossible odds. Keep being the person who sets people free. The world is going to be messy for a while. People are going to make bad choices. Some are going to try to build new tyrannies on the ruins of the old ones. When that happens, remember what Pops taught us. Family isn't about blood, it's about choice. And you've got the biggest family in the world. Take care of them. Take care of yourself, and never stop laughing. Your big brother, Ace PS tells Sabo he still owes me money from that poker game on Luluja Island. By the time Luffy finished reading, he was crying again. But this time there was something else mixed in with the grief, something that looked suspiciously like hope. He's right, you know, Sabo said, reading over his shoulder. About the family thing. Luffy looked around at the assembled faces, his crew, the Whitebeard remnants, the Marines who'd chosen justice over orders, the revolutionaries who traded their cause for simple human decency. Yeah, he said, his voice still rough with emotion but stronger than it had been. He is. That night, as the various fleets began to disperse back to their respective missions, Luffy stood alone on the Sunny's deck, looking up at the stars. You okay, Captain? Brook asked, emerging from the shadows with his violin. No, Luffy replied honestly, but I think that's okay. Ace wouldn't want me to be okay with him being gone. Wise words, Brook agreed. Though I think he'd want you to keep moving forward. Yeah. Luffy took a deep breath, and for the first time since hearing the news, managed a genuine smile. He would. The next morning brought new challenges. Reports of former world government loyalists organizing resistance movements, kingdoms struggling with newfound independence, and the always-present threat of ambitious individuals trying to fill the power vacuum left by the celestial dragon's fall. But it also brought something else: stories of ordinary people choosing extraordinary courage, of former slaves establishing schools, of ex-Marines forming community protection groups, of pirates deciding to become explorers instead of raiders. "Status report," Luffy called out as the crew prepared for departure, and for the first time in days, his voice carried that familiar resonance of absolute determination. "Revolutionary Army forces are coordinating disaster relief in the East Blue," Sabo reported via Den Den Mushi. "Marine Coalition is handling a slaver uprising in the Grand Line," Smoker added. "And we've got 17 different adventure possibilities on our log pose," Nami said with a grin that suggested she was ready for whatever came next. "Sounds perfect," Luffy replied, settling into his favorite spot on the Sunny's figurehead. "Let's go see what's out there." As the Thousand Sunny sailed toward the horizon, carrying its crew toward whatever adventures awaited them, none of them noticed the small memorial that had been carved into the ship's mast. In memory of Portgas Diaz, who chose freedom, the revolution was over. The real work of building a free world was just beginning. And somewhere in the vast blue sky, carried on winds that touched every corner of the liberated world, the sound of laughter echoed, reminding everyone who heard it that no matter how dark things got, there would always be people willing to choose hope over despair. The dawn had come. Now it was time to see what the day would bring. 5 years later, the island that appeared on their log pose had no name on any map, which made it absolutely perfect as far as Luffy was concerned. "Unknown territory," Robin observed with satisfaction, consulting her charts. "No recorded government, no known inhabitants, no established trade routes." In other words, Zoro added with a grin that showed he was just as excited as their captain. "Exactly the kind of place we used to find all the time." It had been 5 years since the fall of Mary Geoise, and the world had settled into something that nobody could have predicted: controlled chaos that somehow worked better than the rigid order that had come before. "Status report from the outside world," Luffy called out, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly worried about whatever the answer might be. "The Grand Alliance of Free Kingdoms is handling a trade dispute between Alabasta and Drum Island," Nami replied, flipping through recent newspapers. "The Marine Coalition stopped a slaving operation in the South Blue, and apparently King Riku is getting married next month." "Good for him," Luffy said genuinely. "Anything we need to worry about? 3 different groups have declared themselves the New World Government this week," Robin added with amusement. 2 of them lasted less than 48 hours before their own members voted them out of existence. And the third disbanded yesterday when they realized they had no idea what they actually wanted to govern. The crew shared a laugh at that. It had become a running joke over the past 5 years. Every few months, someone would declare themselves the rightful ruler of the world, only to discover that most people were perfectly happy ruling themselves. "Thank you very much." "Any word from the others?" Chopper asked. "Sabo's got his hands full with the South Blue Recovery Project," Frankie reported. "Apparently someone tried to restart the slave trade using old Celestial Dragon contracts." "How'd that go for them?" Sanji asked with the kind of smile that suggested he already knew the answer. "About as well as you'd expect when Sabo gets personally offended. Marco's still running the Maritime Protection Service," Usopp added. "Says business is good, turns out people like having former pirates protect their shipping lanes from current pirates. And Smoker just got promoted to Fleet Admiral of the Marine Coalition," Brook announced. "Though he says it's the worst job he's ever had because now he has to attend meetings instead of punching bad guys." Luffy chuckled at that. The new Marine organization was a far cry from the world government's military arm, voluntary, democratic, and focused entirely on protection rather than control. It drove career military types like Smoker absolutely crazy, which somehow made it work even better. "What about Shanks?" Luffy asked. "Still sailing around being cryptically helpful," Robin replied. "Last report had him mediating a dispute between 2 Yonko crews who couldn't agree on island territory. There are still Yonko, sort of. The title doesn't mean what it used to, but some of the old crews kept it for tradition." Robin's smile was fond. "Apparently Big Mom has turned the whole Cake Island chain into a massive restaurant franchise. And Kaido opened a gym." Everyone stared at her. "I'm sorry, what?" Nami asked. "A gym," Robin repeated calmly. "Train like a beast, Kaido's ultimate warrior workout. It's apparently very popular with young pirates who want to build their strength without, quote, all that boring conquering stuff." The mental image of the former beast pirates running aerobics classes was too much for anyone to handle with dignity. "Okay," Luffy said once he'd stopped laughing, "that's the best thing I've heard all month." As they approached the unnamed island, details became visible that made it even more intriguing. Ancient ruins covered in vegetation suggested a civilization that had vanished long ago, while the lack of any recent construction indicated it had been uninhabited for generations. "Think there's treasure?" Nami asked hopefully. "Think there's adventure?" Luffy countered. "Think there's food?" came from both their captain and cook simultaneously, which broke the crew up all over again. Some things apparently never changed. They made landfall on a beach that looked like something out of a storybook. White sand, crystal clear water, and palm trees swaying in a breeze that carried the scent of tropical flowers. But it was what lay beyond the beach that caught their attention. "Are those ruins?" Chopper asked, squinting at the structures visible through the jungle. "Ancient ones by the look of it," Robin confirmed, her archaeologist instincts already engaged. "Prevoid century construction techniques, but with architectural elements I don't recognize." "So definitely worth exploring," Zoro concluded, his hand already resting on his sword hilt out of habit rather than concern. "Definitely," Luffy agreed, his awakened senses picking up something interesting deeper in the jungle. Not dangerous, just significant. The trek through the island's interior revealed layer after layer of fascinating details. The ruins weren't just buildings. They were a complex city that had been carefully integrated with the natural environment. Streets that followed the contours of the land, buildings that incorporated living trees into their structure, and everywhere, stone carvings that depicted scenes of daily life from a civilization that had clearly valued harmony over conquest. "Look at this," Robin called out from what appeared to have been a central square. "The inscriptions, they're in multiple languages, old scripts, but I can make out the meaning." "What do they say?" Usopp asked, though he was more interested in examining what looked like the remains of some kind of mechanical device. "Here lived the people who chose their own way," Robin translated slowly, "who welcomed strangers, who shared their knowledge, who believed that freedom was not something to be hoarded but something to be given freely to all." "Sounds familiar," Sanji observed with a smile. "There's more," Robin continued. "We go now to the stars, but we leave this message for those who come after. The world is vast, and there is room for everyone to find their own path. May you choose yours with wisdom and walk it with joy." "They left?" Nami asked. "The whole civilization just left?" "Apparently so," Robin replied, consulting more inscriptions. "According to this, they developed some kind of technology that allowed them to. Well, the translation is a bit unclear, but it seems like they found a way to travel beyond this world." "To the stars," Luffy repeated thoughtfully. "They got tired of this world and went looking for new ones." "The ultimate adventure," Brook mused. "Leaving behind everything you know to explore the truly unknown." They spent the rest of the day exploring the ruins, each discovery painting a picture of a society that had somehow achieved exactly what the modern world was still struggling toward: true freedom, balanced with genuine cooperation. There were no palaces that suggested rulers, no dungeons that indicated oppression, no weapons caches that implied constant warfare. Just the remnants of a people who had figured out how to live together without anyone being in charge. "Think we could do that?" Chopper asked as they made camp for the night in what had once been the city's central plaza. "Build something like this." "We already are," Luffy replied, settling back against a moss-covered stone that had probably once been someone's front steps. "Just not all in one place." "What do you mean?" "I mean look around," Luffy gestured broadly, though it wasn't clear if he meant the ruins or the world in general. 5 years ago, the world was run by people who thought they knew what was best for everyone. Now it's run by, well, everyone, and somehow it's working. "It's messy though," Nami pointed out. "Lots of arguments, lots of conflicts, lots of people making mistakes." "Yeah," Luffy agreed cheerfully. "Isn't it great?" "You really think chaos is better than order?" Brook asked, though his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than disagreement. "I think freedom is better than control," Luffy corrected. "And sometimes freedom looks like chaos to people who are used to everything being decided for them." As night fell and the crew settled into comfortable conversation around their campfire, none of them noticed the soft glow that had begun emanating from the ruins around them. Not threatening, just responsive, as if the ancient stones were somehow pleased to have visitors who understood what the original inhabitants had been trying to achieve. "You know what I figured out," Luffy said suddenly, staring up at the stars visible through the jungle canopy. "About being Pirate King, I mean." Everyone went quiet. In all the chaos of the past 5 years, Luffy had never really talked about whether he still wanted the title that had originally driven his journey. It was never about ruling anything, he continued. Roger wasn't the Pirate King because he conquered everyone else. He was the Pirate King because he was the freest person on the seas. And now, Robin asked gently. Now everyone gets to be that free, Luffy replied with a grin that could have powered the entire island. Which means the job's done. So what's next? Zoro asked. Luffy looked around at his crew, his family, and felt the same excitement he'd experienced the day they'd first set sail from Fushia village. Next, we explore, he said simply. We find islands nobody's ever seen, we meet people nobody's ever met, we have adventures nobody's ever had. Just like we always have, Sanji added with satisfaction. Just like we always will, Usopp agreed. As if in response to their words, the glow from the ruins intensified slightly, and for just a moment they could have sworn they heard something impossible. The sound of ancient laughter, carried on winds that had been waiting 5 years for someone to understand the joke. The next morning brought a discovery that none of them had expected. Hidden in what appeared to have been the civilization's library was a device that was definitely not ancient, a recording Den Den Mushi, still functional after who knew how long. Should we? Chopper asked nervously. Absolutely, Luffy replied without hesitation. The message that played was brief, but it changed everything. Greetings, travelers from the world we left behind. If you're hearing this message, it means our sensors detected something interesting. The resonance frequency that indicates someone has achieved what our ancestors called the Liberation Awakening. The crew exchanged glances. That sounded suspiciously familiar. We are the descendants of those who built this city, and we want you to know that your world's journey toward freedom has not gone unnoticed. We've been watching from very far away, and we're proud of what you've accomplished. Watching from where? Frankie muttered. We left this world because we had learned everything it could teach us about freedom and cooperation. But we always hoped that someday others would learn those same lessons. It seems that day has finally come. The recording paused, and when it resumed, there was something that sounded suspiciously like joy in the voice. The stars are vast, and there are wonders beyond anything your world has dreamed of. Civilizations that sing planets into existence, oceans that flow between galaxies, adventures that span entire cosmic ages. That sounds, Usopp started. Amazing, Luffy finished, his eyes practically glowing with excitement. When you're ready, and only when you're ready, the path to the stars is open. The device you're listening to contains coordinates to the first stepping stone, but remember, the greatest adventure is always the one you choose for yourself. The recording ended, leaving them in stunned silence. So, Nami said finally, anyone else feeling like our story just got a whole lot bigger? The stars, Robin breathed, her mind already racing with possibilities. Think about the histories we could discover, the civilizations we could meet, the mysteries we could solve. The food they might have, Sanji added dreamily. The new fighting techniques I could learn, Zoro said with anticipation. The medical knowledge I could gain, Chopper chimed in. But, Brooke said thoughtfully, what about this world, the one we just finished liberating? All eyes turned to Luffy, who was staring at the device with an expression of intense concentration. You know what, he said finally, I think this world's going to be just fine without us. Really? Nami asked. Really, we didn't save it by staying and running everything. We saved it by showing people they could save themselves. Luffy's grin returned in full force. Besides, wouldn't it be boring if we just stuck around and made sure everyone was making the right choices? So we're really going to do this? Usopp asked, though his voice carried more excitement than fear. Leave everything behind and head for the stars. Not everything, Luffy corrected, looking around at his crew. We're taking the most important things with us. Our dreams, Chopper asked. Our friendship, Brooke suggested. Our sense of adventure, Robin added. All of that, Luffy agreed. Plus Sanji's cooking, because I'm not exploring the galaxy on empty stomach. The laughter that followed echoed off the ancient stones, mixing with that phantom sound of long-dead joy, creating something that sounded suspiciously like the universe itself laughing along with them. That evening, as they prepared the Sunny for a journey unlike any they'd ever attempted, messages arrived from across the world. The Marine Coalition wishes you fair winds and following seas, Smoker's voice crackled through the Den Den Mushi. Try not to start any interstellar incidents. The Revolutionary Army salutes your continued commitment to liberation, Dragon added. The stars have no idea what's coming. Marco here. The Maritime Protection Service will keep your world safe while you're gone. Just, maybe check in occasionally, some of us worry. And from all of us came Vivi's voice, representing the Grand Alliance of Free Kingdoms. Thank you. For everything, the world you're leaving behind is free because of the choice you made to be free yourselves. As night fell on their last day on the planet of their birth, Luffy stood at the Sunny's bow and looked up at the stars, no longer distant lights, but destinations waiting to be explored. Any regrets? Zoro asked, joining him at the rail. About leaving, Luffy considered the question seriously. No, about not staying to see how everything turns out. Maybe a little. Think they'll be okay without us. I think they'll be better than okay, Luffy replied with certainty, because they'll be making their own choices, having their own adventures, solving their own problems. That's what freedom actually means, not needing someone else to tell you how to live. The next morning, under a sky that seemed unusually bright, the Thousand Sunny activated coordinates that had been waiting in ancient stone for longer than recorded history. Ready, Captain? Nami asked from the helm, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. Ready, Luffy replied, and his voice carried that familiar resonance, not of power, but of absolute certainty in the choice they were making. The Sunny rose from the ocean not like a ship, but like a dream finally deciding to become real. Higher and higher, until the world below became a blue marble set in infinite darkness. It's beautiful, Robin whispered, watching their home planet shrink behind them. It's free, Luffy corrected with satisfaction. Just like we always wanted it to be. And somewhere far below in the world they'd helped liberate, people looked up at the morning sky and saw a star that seemed to be laughing as it danced among the constellations. The dawn they'd brought to their world was complete. Now it was time to see what other worlds were waiting for the sun to rise. The liberation of one world is just the beginning of an infinite adventure. Final log entry of the Thousand Sunny Monkey D. Luffy, Pirate King, first captain to sail beyond the stars, the end, and the beginning. So yeah, Luffy went from I'm gonna be Pirate King to actually, never mind, I'm gonna explore space because ruling stuff is boring. The absolute madman liberated an entire world, said you guys figure it out, and yeeted himself into the cosmos. That's character growth if I've ever seen it. What hit you hardest? Ace's sacrifice giving meaning to his survival, Luffy learning that freedom means letting people make their own mistakes. Or just the sheer audacity of ending with BTW, we're going to explore the galaxy now. Let me know what other insane scenarios you want to see, and yeah, subscribe if this broke your brain as much as it broke mine. Catch you later.